I shouldn't have gone. That's the thing I keep coming back to, lying awake at 3 in the morning with my heart doing that uneven flutter it's had ever since. I shouldn't have gone, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. It started with accessing the dark web. Not for anything extreme or twisted. I wasn't looking for any trouble. I just wanted some cannabis. My usual source had dried up after he'd had a scare with the police, and I'd been without for a couple of months. I wasn't gagging for it or anything, but I missed having something to help me sleep, to quiet my head down in the evenings. A bloke I vaguely knew mentioned, sort of offhandedly, that you could buy practically anything on there these days. He made it sound mundane, like ordering from Amazon. So I looked into it, watched a few videos, read some guides. It was easier than I'd expected, if I'm being honest. Within an hour or so, I was browsing marketplaces that looked surprisingly ordinary. Product listings, star ratings, customer reviews. The whole thing had this weird legitimacy to it, like someone had built eBay for illegal goods. I found what I was looking for pretty quickly. The seller had decent feedback, hundreds of transactions, people saying the quality was good, and it arrived discreetly. The listing said postal delivery, which seemed ideal. Low risk. Just wait for a padded envelope to arrive, and that would be that. But there was another option at the bottom, one I almost scrolled past. Local collection available for buyers in certain areas. I clicked through out of curiosity more than anything else. There was a list of cities. Mine was on there. The price for collection was about 20 quid cheaper, which wasn't the main draw. What interested me was the speed. Delivery would take nearly a week, maybe longer. Collection could be arranged within a couple of days. And there was something appealing about the human element, strange as that sounds. It felt more real, less like I was doing something properly dodgy, just meeting someone, a quick exchange, then home. I think about that logic now and want to shake myself. I spent a day deliberating, kept opening the listing and staring at it, trying to decide. The rational part of my brain was saying to just go with postal delivery, that meeting a stranger was asking for trouble. But another part kept pointing out how many successful transactions he'd completed, how the reviews specifically mentioned collection going smoothly. One person had written that the seller was professional and quick, in and out in under a minute. Another said they'd been nervous, but it was completely fine, nothing to worry about. I read through dozens of these reviews. Looking back, I was probably trying to convince myself, seeking validation for a decision I'd already made. The cheaper price and faster turnaround were factors, sure, but mostly, I think I just wanted to prove to myself that I could do it, that I wasn't as risk-averse and boring as I sometimes felt. Stupid reasoning. Really, genuinely stupid. The seller's username was something forgettable, just random letters and numbers. I sent a message through the site system saying I was interested in collection. The reply came back within a few hours, brief and businesslike. He asked what area I was in, and I told him. He said he could do Thursday evening if that worked. I agreed, perhaps too quickly. We arranged the specifics through a series of short messages over the next day. He suggested a car park behind a row of shops on the outskirts of town, the kind of area that's busy during the day but empties out after dark. I'd driven past it hundreds of times without really noticing it. 8 o'clock on a Thursday evening. He'd be driving a dark blue Vauxhall. I should approach the passenger side and he'd hand it over through the window. Simple enough. I'd been overthinking it, clearly. The days leading up to Thursday had this strange quality to them. I'd go about my normal routine, but my mind would drift to the meeting, running through different scenarios. Most of them were fine. A few were disasters, but I pushed those aside. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. It felt like the kind of thing that would sound worse when said aloud, that would invite questions and judgment I didn't want to deal with. Thursday came around and I spent the whole day feeling slightly sick. Not scared exactly, just apprehensive. I kept telling myself it was fine. People did this sort of thing all the time. The reviews on his page were genuine. This was just a transaction. In and out in 2 minutes. I left the house around 7:30. Told myself I was just popping out. Kept it casual, even though there was no one there to perform for. The drive over took about 15 minutes. I had the radio on, but couldn't focus on what was playing. Just background noise to fill the silence. I arrived deliberately early. Wanted to scope the place out. Make sure it felt safe. The car park was tucked away behind a discount furniture shop and a tile warehouse, both closed for the day. There were a few other cars scattered about, probably belonging to people who lived in the flats nearby. A white van with faded lettering on the side, a small red hatchback that had seen better days, a silver estate car that looked abandoned, one tire completely flat. Streetlights cast everything in that sickly orange glow. It was drizzling slightly, that fine mist that doesn't look like much but soaks through your clothes. The kind of evening where you can't decide if you need your wipers on or not. I parked near the entrance and waited, checked my phone obsessively, looked at the other cars, trying to work out which one might be his. There was a blue Vauxhall in the far corner, but it looked lighter than he'd described, more grey than blue, and no one was sitting in it. The minutes crawled past. I watched a cat slink between two wheelie bins near the back fence. A couple walked past on the pavement outside, arguing about something in low voices. A bus went by on the main road, almost empty. 8 o'clock came and went, then 15:15. I was starting to think he wasn't coming, feeling that weird mix of relief and disappointment when a car pulled in. Dark blue Vauxhall, just like he'd said. It drove slowly past me and parked 3 or 4 spaces away, backing into the spot so it faced outward. The engine cut out, headlights off. I couldn't see much through the windscreen. The driver was just a silhouette. I waited for some kind of signal, but nothing came. No flash of lights, no wave, nothing. After a minute or so, I decided to just get on with it. And their staring at each other was pointless and weird. I climbed out of my car, locked it out of habit, and walked over. The drizzle was heavier now, proper rain starting to form. My jacket wasn't waterproof, and I could feel the damp seeping through. The passenger window was down about halfway. I bent slightly to look inside. The driver was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-20s. Tracksuit, hood up despite being inside the car. I couldn't see much of his face in the dim light. He didn't look at me directly, just stared forward through the windscreen. I said hello, tried to sound casual. My voice came out thinner than I'd intended. He didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge I'd spoken. Just reached across to the passenger seat and picked up a small plastic bag, the kind you'd get from a corner shop. He held it out through the window. I took it and glanced inside. It looked about right. A small clear bag inside the carrier, some green material visible. I reached into my jacket pocket for the cash I'd prepared. 3 20s folded together. That's when things went wrong. As I pulled the notes out, his hand shot through the window and grabbed my wrist. Not hard enough to hurt, but firm, controlling. His other hand appeared holding something I couldn't quite make out in the darkness. My brain was trying to process what was happening, still a step behind. He told me to give him everything. Wallet, phone, keys. His voice was flat, matter of fact. Like he'd done this before. Like it was routine. I just stood there for a moment, stupid with shock. Some part of me was still trying to make it make sense, like maybe this was some kind of test or misunderstanding. Maybe I'd misheard him. Maybe this was how these things worked and I was being naive. But his grip tightened on my wrist, and he repeated himself, more insistent. Give him everything, now. The thing he was holding was a screwdriver. I could see it properly now, the metal shaft catching the streetlight. Long, maybe 8 inches. The kind you'd use for heavy-duty work. He wasn't waving it around or being theatrical about it. Just holding it steady, pointed vaguely in my direction, making the threat clear. My first thought, bizarrely, was about the reviews. All those people saying it went smoothly, that he was professional. Were they lies? Part of the setup? Or was I just special, the unlucky one he decided to rob? I should have just complied, given him what he wanted. It was only stuff, nothing worth getting hurt over. My wallet had maybe 40 quid in it, some cards I could cancel. My phone was a year old, nothing special. The car keys were the biggest loss, but even that was just inconvenience, not disaster. But something in me panicked, and I yanked my arm back hard, twisting away from his grip. The plastic bag fell from my other hand and scattered on the wet tarmac. I stumbled backward, and his car door flew open, slamming into me and knocking me further off balance. He was out of the car fast, faster than I would have thought possible. I turned and ran. I don't remember deciding to run. My body just did it. Pure instinct. I sprinted back toward my car, but he was between me and it now, cutting off that route. So I veered left, toward the back of the car park where a footpath led between 2 buildings. I could hear him behind me, not shouting, not saying anything, just footsteps slapping against wet pavement getting closer. That silence was worse somehow, more frightening than if he'd been yelling threats or demands. The path was narrow, barely wide enough for one person. Walls on both sides, brick on the left and wooden fencing on the right. It was darker here, away from the street lights, and I couldn't see properly. I was running on adrenaline and terror, my breathing already ragged. The path curved, and I nearly lost my footing on the slick ground. I put a hand out to steady myself against the wall, felt the rough brick scrape against my palm, and kept going. Behind me, his footsteps were still there, relentless and steady. He wasn't gaining on me, but he wasn't falling behind either. Just maintaining the same distance, like he knew he could keep this up longer than I could. Why was he still chasing me? I dropped the bag, left it behind. He could have just taken it and gone, unless this had never been about the cannabis at all. Maybe the whole listing was a setup, a way to lure people to isolated spots. Maybe he'd done this to dozens of others. Maybe some of them hadn't got away. These thoughts were flashing through my head in fragments, none of them fully formed. Mostly, I was just focused on running, on the burning in my lungs and the sound of him behind me. The path opened out into a residential street. Rows of terraced houses, cars parked bumper to bumper on both sides, lights on in some windows. Normal life happening just meters away, completely oblivious. I thought about screaming, banging on someone's door, but I was gasping too hard to make much noise, and he was right there, close enough that I could hear his breathing. I ran down the middle of the street, my shoes slapping against the road, looked back over my shoulder and immediately regretted it. He was maybe 10 meters behind, hood still up, face in shadow. Something about seeing him in the open like that, in this normal suburban street, made it worse somehow, more real. This wasn't happening in some dark alley or abandoned building. This was happening in the middle of ordinary life, and nobody was noticing. I turned at the end of the road, took a random left, then another right, trying to lose him in the maze of identical streets. My chest was screaming and there was a stitch developing in my side, but I didn't dare slow down. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, could taste copper in my mouth. After another turn, I risked another glance back. The street behind me was empty. I kept running anyway, not trusting it. Took 2 more turns and then ducked into a front garden, crouching behind a car. Tried to control my breathing, listening for footsteps. Nothing. Just the sound of a television through someone's window and distant traffic. Someone laughing inside one of the houses. A dog barking a few streets over. I stayed there for what felt like 20 minutes, but was probably closer to 5. Slowly, my heart rate came down from its frantic hammering. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands, realized I had no idea where I was. The streets all looked the same. Victorian terraces with identical front doors and tiny gardens. I'd been running blind, taking turns at random. I opened the map and tried to work out a route back to the car park. My hands were trembling so badly, I kept mistyping. Eventually, I got it sorted and started plotting a path. The walk back took me nearly 40 minutes. I went the long way round, sticking to main roads where there were people and lights. Even then, I felt exposed, vulnerable. Kept checking behind me every few seconds. Every car that passed made me tense up, certain it would be the blue Vauxhall circling back to find me. I passed a pub, warm light spilling out onto the pavement, people smoking outside and chatting. I thought about going in, hiding there for an hour or so, but the idea of being around people felt impossible. I couldn't imagine making small talk or pretending to be normal. So I walked past and kept going. My clothes were soaked through by now. The rain had picked up properly and I was shivering, though I couldn't tell if it was from cold or shock or both. My legs felt weak and unstable, like they might give out at any moment. When I finally made it back to the car park, his car was gone. So was mine. I stood there staring at the empty space where I'd parked, my brain struggling to process this final kick. Of course he'd taken it. I'd left the keys in my jacket pocket, and he'd had plenty of time while I was running in circles through the estate. Probably drove straight back here after I'd lost him, let himself in, and helped himself. The plastic bag was still there on the ground, dark and soggy with rain. I left it where it lay. I walked to the main road and called a taxi. Stood under the awning of the furniture shop while I waited, dripping and shaking. The driver who picked me up gave me a look, but didn't ask questions. I was grateful for that. I reported it to the police as stolen, left out the bit about the dark web, obviously. Said I'd parked up and someone must have taken it while I was walking around. They were polite, but clearly not that bothered. Gave me a crime reference number and said they'd be in touch if it turned up. Asked if I'd seen anyone suspicious. I said no. It did turn up, about a week later. Burned out in a field just outside town. Completely gutted. The police said it was probably joyriders. I didn't correct them. The insurance process was tedious and humiliating. They asked all sorts of questions about where I'd been, why I'd left the keys in the car, whether I'd locked it properly. I stuck to my story. Eventually they paid out, minus the excess, and I bought a replacement. Nothing special, just something to get me from A to B. I think about that night constantly, not in a dramatic, traumatized way, just little flashes throughout the day. Seeing his hand shoot through that window, the sound of footsteps behind me in the dark, the empty space where my car had been, the screwdriver catching the light. Mostly I think about the reviews, all those positive comments on his listing, people saying the transaction went smoothly, that he was reliable. Were any of them real? Or were they all part of the setup? Fake accounts building credibility? Maybe some were genuine and I was just unlucky, the one he decided to target. Or maybe everyone who left a bad review simply never got the chance. I went back to the dark web a few days later, once I'd calmed down enough to think straight. Wanted to see if his listing was still there. It was gone. The whole account had vanished. I tried searching variations of the username but found nothing, like he'd never existed. I don't know. I'll never know. I don't go near that stuff anymore. Hardly even drink these days. The whole thing taught me that the normal rules don't apply once you step outside normal channels. There's no customer service, no protection, no recourse. You're just vulnerable, and some people will exploit that without a second thought. The worst part is how ordinary it all was. No masks, no weapons really, just a screwdriver. No abandoned warehouses or dramatic showdowns. Just a rundown car park and a residential street and a bloke in a tracksuit. That's what real danger looks like, I suppose. Not cinematic or exciting, just squalid and frightening and pointless. I still live in the same town. Sometimes I see dark blue Vauxhalls and my stomach drops before I can remind myself it's irrational. Sometimes I'm walking somewhere at night and I hear footsteps behind me and I have to fight the urge to run. Sometimes I drive past that car park and feel my chest tighten. My breathing goes shallow. I never saw him again. Never heard anything. It was like it never happened, except for the insurance claim and the nightmares I had for a couple of months afterward, and this jumpy, paranoid feeling that never quite goes away. I was lucky, I know that. It could have been so much worse. He could have caught me. He could have used that screwdriver. I could have hit my head when I fell, or run into traffic, or any number of things. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd tripped during that chase, if I'd gone down on that narrow path with him right behind me. I don't let myself think about it for long. But knowing you were lucky doesn't make it feel any better somehow. It just makes you realize how close you came to something terrible, and how easily it could happen again. How thin the line is between normal life and absolute disaster. How quickly things can spiral out of control. I've never told anyone this, not properly. Partly because I'm ashamed of how naive I was, but mostly because I don't want to hear what they'd say. That it was my own fault, that I should have known better, that anyone with half a brain would have seen it coming. They'd be right, of course. I should never have gone. I've been sitting on this story for nearly 3 years now. Every time I consider sharing it, something stops me. Maybe fear, maybe guilt, maybe the knowledge that once it's out there, I can't take it back. But after what happened last Tuesday, I need to get this off my chest. Some things you just can't explain to someone who hasn't seen what the internet really hides. It started with boredom, honestly. Nothing dramatic, no tragic backstory. Just a guy with too much time on his hands and a fancy gaming PC that could handle pretty much anything. I'd recently moved to Bristol for a job in IT security, ironically enough. I was living alone for the first time, in one of those cookie-cutter apartment blocks they keep throwing up near city centres. The walls were thin enough that I could hear my neighbours sneeze, but somehow I still felt isolated. My friends were all back in Birmingham, and I wasn't great at the whole making new connections thing. So I spent a lot of nights at home, gaming or browsing the web. I'd known about the dark web for years, of course. Anyone in IT security does. I'd even accessed it a few times for research purposes during uni, checking out how certain black markets operated so we could better understand security vulnerabilities. Nothing sinister, just academic curiosity. But on this particular night, a rainy Tuesday in October, I was especially restless. I'd finished a 12-hour shift sorting out a ransomware issue for a client, and my brain was still buzzing even though my body was exhausted. That weird combination where you're too tired to do anything productive, but too wired to sleep. So I set up a secure browser, connected through a couple of VPNs, force of habit from work, and started browsing. At first, it was just the usual stuff. Marketplaces selling drugs, forums discussing privacy, sites offering counterfeit documents. I remember the soft blue glow of my monitor reflecting on my coffee mug, the one with the faded Liverpool FC logo that I'd had since uni. My eyes were getting heavy, and I was about to call it a night when a notification popped up on one of the forums I'd been browsing. Someone had messaged me directly, which was unusual. I'd been lurking, not posting. I wasn't even using a regular username, just a randomly generated string of characters. The message was simple, asking if I was looking for something specific. I almost ignored it. My IT security brain was throwing up red flags like crazy. But there was that curiosity again, that same itch that had gotten me browsing the dark web in the first place. I responded non-committally, saying I was just exploring. The conversation that followed seemed benign enough, just someone being friendly, asking about my interests, how long I'd been on the forum. Looking back, they were clearly probing to see if I was law enforcement, but at the time, it just felt like casual chat. I was distracted anyway, half watching a YouTube video in another window, and occasionally getting up to stretch my legs or refill my coffee. My flat had that faintly musty smell it always got when it rained. I never could figure out where the dampness was coming from. About 20 minutes into the conversation, they shared a link. Said it might interest me based on what we'd been discussing, which had drifted to the topic of how much of what people claimed about the dark web was urban legend versus reality. I hesitated. Clicking random links on the dark web is basically security suicide 101. But they mentioned it was a forum specifically discussing the myths and realities of services for hire on the dark web, supposedly debunking the hitman for hire sites as scams, which they mostly are. I was genuinely interested from a professional standpoint. I'd been teaching a module on digital security that touched on exactly this subject. My finger hovered over the trackpad. I really should have known better. I'd literally spent that morning cleaning up after a ransomware attack that started with someone clicking a suspicious link. But it was late, I was tired, and my judgment was compromised. I clicked. It took me to what looked like another forum, but more sophisticated than most dark websites. Clean design, proper formatting. None of the clunky early 2000s aesthetics that dominate most .onion domains. I had to create an account to view most of the content, which again set off alarm bells, but I used all my usual precautions: temporary email, generated password, fake details. The verification process was more thorough than usual, requiring me to complete a series of puzzles rather than just clicking a link. That should have been another warning sign, but I was mildly impressed by the security measures. Professional curiosity, I suppose. Once in, I browsed a few threads. It seemed legitimate enough. Discussions about various dark web services, debates about which ones were scams, analyses of how law enforcement tracked these kinds of operations. There was a whole section dedicated to service provider vetting that claimed to verify whether sellers of various illegal services were legitimate or not. I remember my eyes starting to sting from staring at the screen too long, and I rubbed them, noticing the stubble on my chin. I hadn't shaved in days, hadn't really needed to, since I was working remotely that week. Then I noticed a locked thread titled Verification Events. It had thousands of views, but only a handful of replies. Something about the clinical terminology made me uneasy, but I was already in too deep. I clicked it, only to get a message that this section was for verified members only. Below, it was a link to apply for verification. The application form was brief, asking about my interests and what I hoped to gain from verification. I was vague, saying I was researching the reality behind dark web legends for academic purposes. I didn't expect anything to come of it. These exclusive forums usually ignored new members, so I was surprised when, less than 5 minutes later, I received a notification that my application was being processed and I should remain online. While waiting, I got up to use the bathroom. The linoleum was cold under my feet. I kept meaning to buy a bath mat, but somehow never remembered when I was actually out shopping. When I came back, there was a new notification. My application had been provisionally approved, pending a demonstration verification session that would begin in 10 minutes. There was a countdown timer and instructions to ensure my connection was stable and secure. I should have logged off right then. Every instinct I developed over years in IT security was screaming at me to disconnect. But there was a strange sense of detachment, almost like I was watching someone else make these decisions. I told myself it was just professional curiosity, that I'd watch the demonstration, gather information about how these scams operated, and then report it through proper channels. I even opened a text document to take notes, as if that somehow made what I was doing legitimate research rather than dangerous stupidity. The countdown reached 0, and my screen changed to what looked like a video streaming interface with a chat panel to the right. A message appeared stating that the demonstration would begin shortly, and that this was a proof of capability session for new clients. No interaction or bidding would be permitted during the demonstration. This was observation only. The video began playing. At first, it showed an ordinary street somewhere urban. Could have been anywhere in Britain or Europe. Brick buildings, parked cars, streetlights casting orange pools on wet pavement. The camera appeared to be stationary but high quality, possibly mounted somewhere overlooking the street. A timestamp in the corner showed it was live footage, just minutes behind real time. I remember noticing condensation forming on my window as the rain outside grew heavier, creating rivulets that distorted the view of the building across the street. For several minutes, nothing happened. The chat remained quiet, except for occasional messages confirming that members were connected and viewing. Then a car pulled up, a dark-colored sedan, nothing distinctive. A man got out, looked to be in his 40s, wearing a business suit. He locked the car and started walking down the street, checking his phone. The camera followed him, which meant it wasn't stationary as I'd first thought. Someone was controlling it remotely, tracking this random businessman as he walked. I felt the first real stab of unease. This wasn't a demonstration of a scam. This was surveillance of an actual person. A message appeared in the chat, giving a brief profile of the man. His name, occupation, home address, details about his family, and below that, the reason he'd been selected. Allegations of embezzlement from a company pension fund. Money that belonged to people who had worked their whole lives for a secure retirement. The message explained that this was a contracted demonstration, the fee already paid by former employees who had lost their savings. The clinical tone made it all the more disturbing, like reading a weather report that happened to be describing a hurricane heading straight for you. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. It had to be staged. An elaborate performance to convince potential clients that they were legitimate. I almost convinced myself of that until the camera angle changed, and I saw a new figure enter the frame. Someone wearing dark clothing and a nondescript cap, walking on the opposite side of the street in the same direction as the businessman. The chat became more active. Comments appeared noting the operator's approach, discussing the technique being demonstrated. Some mentioned previous demonstrations they'd witnessed, comparing methodologies. I felt sick but couldn't look away. It was like watching a nature documentary where you know the gazelle is about to be taken down by a lion, but it's happening in slow motion. The businessman stopped at a corner, waiting to cross. The operator casually crossed the street, ending up just behind him. They were now both waiting for the traffic light to change. I remember holding my breath, my coffee forgotten and growing cold beside me. The ticking of my cheap wall clock seemed abnormally loud in the silence of my flat. When it happened, it was so quick I almost missed it. As the light changed and people began to cross, the operator moved directly behind the businessman. There was a slight motion, just a small movement of their arm. And then they were walking past, continuing on as the businessman took a few more steps and then suddenly stumbled. At first, it looked like he'd simply tripped. He put his hand against the building to steady himself, then touched his side where the operator had been. His expression changed from confusion to alarm. He looked around, seemingly trying to call out, but no one stopped. He slid down the wall to a sitting position, his briefcase still clutched in one hand. The camera stayed on him as people walked past, most not even noticing the man sitting against the wall. One woman paused, seemed to ask if he was all right, but then moved on when he waved her away. It took less than 3 minutes before his movement stopped completely. Not a single person realized what had happened. To them, it probably just looked like a drunk or someone feeling unwell. The operator was long gone, not even in frame anymore. The camera lingered on the businessman for another minute before the feed cut to black. A message appeared thanking viewers for attending the demonstration and stating that verification of new members had been completed. Those who wished to inquire about services now had access to the necessary channels. I closed my laptop immediately. I felt cold all over, my hands shaking so badly I could barely stand up. I just watched someone being murdered in real time. There was no question in my mind anymore that it was staged. The clinical efficiency, the complete lack of drama, the ordinary setting, it was all too real. I spent the rest of the night pacing my flat, desperately trying to figure out what to do. Go to the police and tell them what? That I'd witnessed a murder somewhere in an unnamed city, committed by someone I couldn't identify, against a victim whose name I only knew from an anonymous forum post. I had no proof, no recording. I hadn't thought to capture the stream, and even if I had, I'd have to admit to being in a place I should never have been. I decided to wait until morning to see if there was any news about a businessman found dead in the street. I checked every news site I could think of, searched for any reports of unexpected deaths or murders. Nothing. Either it hadn't been reported yet, or it had happened somewhere whose local news I couldn't access, or the thought that kept creeping back despite my attempts to suppress it. They were efficient enough to have removed the body before it was discovered. For days afterward, I was a wreck. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat properly. I kept checking the forum, but my account had been deactivated. The link I'd been sent no longer worked. It was as if the entire thing had never existed. I considered anonymous tips to various police departments, but had no idea where to even begin. Which jurisdiction? What details could I provide that wouldn't immediately be dismissed as a hoax or the ravings of a paranoid mind? Eventually, I convinced myself that maybe it had been elaborate theatre after all. A convincing performance designed to scam people out of money for hitman services that would never be delivered. The alternative was too horrible to contemplate, that I had witnessed an actual murder and done nothing about it. I moved flats the next month, telling myself it was because I'd found a better place closer to work. In reality, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I opened my laptop, I imagined someone on the other end monitoring my activity. I changed my phone number, created new email accounts, scrubbed my online presence as much as possible. Professional paranoia turned up to 11. Life gradually returned to something resembling normal. I dated, made a few friends, even got promoted at work. The memory remained, but it became easier to dismiss as a bizarre experience that couldn't possibly have been what it seemed. Until last Tuesday, I was working late, finishing up a security audit for a client, when an email arrived. No subject line sent to my personal account. The new one I'd created after that night. The sender's address was a string of random characters. The message contained only a link and the words, "We've missed your observations. A new demonstration is scheduled." Below it was my home address, my current address, not the flat where I'd been that night 3 years ago. They'd found me. They'd been watching me all along. I've been staying at a hotel since then, paid in cash. I bought a new laptop that I've never connected to any of my accounts. I'm writing this as a record, a warning maybe, though I don't know who it will reach or how. If you're reading this, remember, the dark web isn't just a playground for curious minds or a marketplace for illegal goods. There are corners of it where the darkest human impulses aren't just fantasies, but services rendered with terrifying efficiency. And once you've seen them, they've seen you too. My hotel room door just rattled, like someone trying the handle. The reception desk isn't answering my call. I think I've run out of places to hide. It was one of the biggest mistakes of my life, agreeing to help someone I'd never met with what seemed like a simple favor. I'm still dealing with the consequences now, months later, and I don't think I'll ever feel entirely safe again. I should start by explaining that I'm a wedding photographer based in Leeds. It's not glamorous work, but it pays reasonably well, and I enjoy it most of the time. The job involves a lot of equipment, multiple cameras and lenses, lighting gear, backup drives for storing the thousands of photos I take at each event. I'd built up a decent reputation over the years, mostly through word of mouth and a portfolio website that showcased my better work. Last February, I received an inquiry through my website contact form. Someone named David explained that he was getting married in June and wanted to discuss booking me for the day. Nothing unusual about that. It's how most of my clients find me. He provided an email address and asked if I could send over my packages and pricing information. I replied with my standard response, outlining the different coverage options and costs. David wrote back quickly, asking several detailed questions about what equipment I used, how I backed up the photos, what my editing process involved. Again, not particularly unusual. Clients often want to know the technical details, especially if they're paying several £100s for the service. What was slightly odd was that David never mentioned his fiancée by name, never provided details about the venue, and seemed more interested in my workflow than the actual creative aspects of wedding photography. When I asked about the wedding location so I could factor in travel time, he said they hadn't finalized the venue yet, but it would be somewhere in Yorkshire. We exchanged probably a dozen emails over the next fortnight. David asked increasingly specific questions about my equipment storage, whether I use cloud backup, how I transferred files between devices, what security measures I had in place for client data. I found myself spending more time explaining my technical setup than I usually would, but he seemed like a cautious person who wanted to ensure his wedding photos would be handled professionally. Eventually, David made what seemed like a reasonable request. He explained that he'd had a bad experience with a previous photographer who'd lost an entire set of engagement photos due to a hard drive failure. Before committing to booking me, he wanted to send me a test file to upload to my system, just to verify that my backup process worked as I'd described. He'd send me a high-resolution image file. I'd process it through my normal workflow, and then confirm it had been backed up properly. It seemed like an unusual level of caution, but not completely unreasonable given his explanation. I agreed, and David sent me a download link to a file hosted on a service I wasn't familiar with. The file was large, around 2 gigabytes, which he explained was because it was an uncompressed RAW image from a professional camera. I downloaded the file and opened it in my editing software. It appeared to be a perfectly normal photograph of a landscape, well composed and properly exposed. Nothing suspicious or concerning about it. I ran it through my standard editing workflow, saved the processed version, and backed it up to my external drives and cloud storage as I would with any client file. I confirmed to David that everything had worked properly, and he seemed satisfied. He said he'd discuss the booking with his fiancée and get back to me about which package they wanted. I didn't hear from him again after that, which wasn't particularly unusual. Plenty of enquiries don't result in bookings. People change their minds or go with other photographers, or decide to cut costs by having a friend take photos instead. I forgot about David entirely until about 3 weeks later, when I started noticing strange activity on my computer. Files would be open when I was certain I'd closed them. My internet connection seemed slower than usual. The computer's fan ran constantly, suggesting something was using significant processing power, even when I wasn't actively working. I assumed I'd picked up some kind of malware, probably from clicking on a dodgy link or visiting a compromised website. I ran several antivirus scans, but nothing came up. The strange behavior continued, and I eventually took the computer to a repair shop to have it properly checked. The technician who looked at it found something I hadn't expected. My computer was running a program that was accessing my files and sending data somewhere over the internet. Not all my files, just specific folders where I stored client photographs and personal documents. The program was well hidden, designed to look like a legitimate system process, and had been active for several weeks. More concerning was that the program appeared to be providing remote access to my computer. Someone, somewhere, had been able to see my screen, access my files, and potentially monitor everything I did on that machine. The technician couldn't determine exactly what had been accessed or copied, but the program had been running continuously since around the time I'd processed that test file from David. I felt sick realizing what had probably happened. That file hadn't been a test of my backup system. It had contained malicious code that installed itself when I opened it, giving David, or whoever he really was, complete access to my computer and everything stored on it. All my client files, years of wedding photographs, personal documents, financial records, passwords saved in my browser, everything. The technician cleaned the malware from my computer and recommended I change all my passwords immediately and monitor my bank accounts for unusual activity. He also suggested I contact my clients to warn them that their photographs might have been compromised, though I had no way of knowing what had actually been accessed. That conversation was excruciating, calling couples to explain that the private photographs from their weddings might have been stolen by a stranger who tricked me into installing malware on my computer. Some were understanding, Others were furious. Several threatened legal action. One couple had specifically requested that certain photos never be shared online, and now I had to tell them those images might be circulating on websites I couldn't access or control. I reported everything to the police, providing all the emails from David and the technical analysis from the repair shop. They took a statement but explained that this type of crime was increasingly common and extremely difficult to prosecute. The email address David used was probably fake. The file hosting service was based overseas, and tracking down whoever was actually responsible would require resources the local police didn't have. A detective suggested I search for my client's photos online to see if they'd been posted anywhere. I spent several evenings doing image searches, checking social media sites, looking for any sign that the stolen photographs had been shared publicly. I found nothing, which should have been reassuring, but somehow made it worse. If the photos weren't being posted publicly, what were they being used for? About a month after I discovered the malware, I received an anonymous message through my website contact form. No name, no email address, just a brief message containing a link and a single sentence, telling me I should see what had happened to my work. The link was to a dark web address, meaningless letters and numbers that couldn't be accessed through normal browsers. I knew I shouldn't follow that link. Nothing good could come from seeing whatever was waiting there. But I needed to know what had been done with those stolen photographs, needed to understand the full extent of what my mistake had enabled. I spent an evening reading about how to access these hidden websites, eventually setting up the necessary software despite my growing dread about what I might find. The process was simpler than I'd expected, though I felt like I was descending into something dark and irrevocable with each step. The website that loaded was designed like a professional gallery site, clean and well organized. But instead of stock photography or artistic work, it displayed wedding photographs. My wedding photographs, dozens of complete sets from different events, all carefully organized by date and labeled with the couple's names. Each gallery had a view counter showing how many times it had been accessed. The numbers were horrifying. Thousands of views for some galleries, hundreds for others. Beneath each set of photos was a price list. People could purchase individual images or entire collections, with the cost varying based on how recent the wedding was and how many photos were included. The comments section below each gallery made me feel physically ill. People discussing the photographs in ways that had nothing to do with photography or weddings, focusing on specific individuals in the images, requesting certain types of shots, sharing the photos on other websites I'd never heard of. My work, taken without permission and sold to strangers who viewed these private moments as entertainment or something worse. But what made everything infinitely worse was discovering that my clients' photos weren't the only ones on the site. There were galleries from dozens of other photographers, thousands of wedding photographs stolen from professionals who'd been tricked the same way I had. An entire marketplace built on exploiting photographers' trust and selling intimate moments that were never meant to be public. I documented everything I could, taking screenshots and recording the website address, then reported it to the police again. They passed the information to a cybercrime unit that specializes in dark web activity, but warned me that shutting down these sites was a complicated process that could take months or years, assuming it could be done at all. The detective I spoke to explained that the photos were valuable because they were genuine rather than staged, showing real people in private moments with their families and friends. Wedding photographs captured people when they were emotional and unguarded, making them particularly sought after by certain communities online. The fact that the subjects had no idea their images were being traded made them even more valuable. I contacted every client whose photos had appeared on that website. Some had already known something was wrong because they'd been contacted by strangers who'd seen their photos, people sending disturbing messages or trying to connect with them on social media. Others had no idea their private moments had been circulating online for months, viewed and discussed by thousands of strangers. The legal consequences were severe. Several clients pursued action against me, claiming I hadn't taken adequate security measures to protect their data. My professional insurance covered some of the costs, but not all of them. My reputation in the industry was destroyed. No one wants to hire a photographer who allowed their clients' photos to be stolen and sold on the dark web. I eventually had to close my business entirely. The website hosting my stolen work was taken down after several months, but the detective confirmed the photos had been copied and redistributed across multiple other sites before it disappeared. Those images are still out there somewhere, accessible to anyone who knows where to look. What haunts me most is thinking about all the other photographers who might be receiving similar inquiries right now, from people claiming to be cautious clients who just want to test backup systems. How many are downloading files they think are harmless test images, installing malware without realizing it, giving strangers access to years of client photographs. I tried to warn others in the industry, posting on photography websites and social media groups about what had happened. Some people took the warning seriously, but others dismissed my story as paranoia or suggested I'd simply been careless with security. No one wants to believe they could fall for the same trick, that a few reasonable-sounding emails could lead to such a catastrophic breach of trust. I've changed careers now, working in retail management, where the worst damage I can do is accidentally over-ordering stock. I don't own a professional camera anymore, don't take photos, except occasional snapshots on my phone. The sight of a wedding party makes me feel anxious and guilty, wondering if their photographer is taking proper security precautions, or if their private moments will end up traded on hidden websites. Sometimes I search for that site, checking if it's been permanently shut down or if it's resurfaced somewhere else. The original address no longer works, but I've found similar sites offering the same service, selling stolen wedding photographs to people who view others' happiness and intimacy as commodities to be purchased. I know David wasn't his real name, and I know I wasn't specifically targeted. I was just one photographer among hundreds who seemed like an easy mark, someone whose livelihood depended on sophisticated equipment and complex workflows that could be exploited. The person who sent that first email probably sent identical messages to dozens of photographers, knowing a percentage would fall for the same story. The test file I downloaded is still on my old hard drives, backed up in multiple locations exactly as I promised it would be. I've never deleted it, keeping it as a reminder of how easily trust can be weaponized and how a single mistake can echo outward in ways you can't predict or control. Those couples trusted me with their wedding photographs, and I failed them in a way that can never be made right. Their private moments exist somewhere in the hidden corners of the internet, viewed and discussed by strangers, and there's nothing I can do to take that back. No amount of apologies or legal settlements can undo what happened because of my mistake. That's what I think about when people ask why I left photography. Not the financial losses or the legal troubles or the destroyed reputation, but the knowledge that I enabled something terrible to happen to people who'd done nothing wrong, except trust the wrong photographer with their memories, and that somewhere online, those images still exist, still being traded and viewed, still causing harm I'll never fully understand. This may may seem like a strange way to start a story, but here goes. Up until very recently, I used to exercise religiously. I'd always use one of those fitness apps that logs your runs and walks, maps your routes, counts your steps, tells you how many calories you burned. It felt good to see the progress, to have concrete data about getting healthier. I used it for nearly a year before I discovered that every route I'd ever taken, every location I'd ever stopped at, every pattern in my daily movement had been compiled into a profile that was being sold to people who had very specific reasons for wanting to know exactly where I'd be and when. People who'd purchased that information multiple times, who'd used it in ways I'm still discovering, who know more about my life than most of my actual friends do. I'm a speech therapist working with children at several primary schools across Derby. It's the kind of job that involves a lot of moving around during the day, visiting different schools, working with kids individually or in small groups. I'm generally active anyway, enjoy keeping fit, try to walk whenever I can, rather than driving everywhere. Using a fitness app seemed like a natural way to track that activity and motivate myself to stay healthy. The app I downloaded was called Health Path. It had decent reviews, a clean interface, seemed straightforward enough. Free basic version, with optional premium features you could pay for, the standard business model for fitness apps. I started using it last January, logging my morning runs around the neighborhood, my walks between schools during the workday, my evening strolls when the weather was nice. The app was quite engaging. It would send encouraging notifications when you hit milestones, suggest routes based on what you'd done before, create statistics showing your progress over time. It had social features too, where you could add friends and see each other's activities, though I never really used that aspect. I just wanted the personal tracking, the satisfaction of seeing my activity logged and quantified. Over the months, I got into a comfortable routine with it. Morning run before work, usually the same 3 or 4 routes through my neighborhood, depending on how much time I had. Walks during the day between school visits. Routes that became predictable as I figured out the quickest paths. Evening walks most days after dinner. Circular routes around the local park or along the canal towpath. The app faithfully recorded all of it, building up a comprehensive picture of my movement patterns. I particularly liked the feature that showed your most frequented locations. It would identify places you visited regularly and give them labels: home, work, gym, that sort of thing. Mine showed my house, the various schools I worked at, a coffee shop I'd stop at most mornings between appointments, the park where I'd do my evening walks. It was oddly satisfying seeing my regular life mapped out like that. Proof that I had a routine and structure to my days. Around 6 months into using the app, I started noticing a car that seemed to appear in the same locations I did. A silver Audi that I'd see parked near my house in the mornings. Then later parked near one of the schools I worked at. Then sometimes near the coffee shop or the park. I thought it was coincidence at first. Someone who happened to have a similar routine to mine, living and working in the same areas. But the timing of the appearances was too consistent. The car would be parked on my street when I left for my morning run, usually a few houses down, and I'd see it pull away shortly after I started running. Then it would be at one of my school locations later that same day, parked with a clear view of the entrance. It started to feel less like coincidence and more like someone was deliberately being in the same place as I was, following a schedule that matched mine too closely to be random. I tried to see who was driving it, but the windows were tinted enough that I could never get a clear view. I never saw anyone get in or out. It was just there, consistently present in locations where I spent time, watching without ever doing anything overtly threatening or illegal. I reported it to the police after about 2 weeks of noticing this pattern. They took a statement but explained that someone parking legally on public streets wasn't something they could act on unless there was evidence of actual harassment or threats. They took the registration number and said they'd look into it, but they were honest about not being able to do much without clear evidence of criminal intent. The car stopped appearing after I filed that police report, which should have been reassuring, but actually made me more uneasy. It suggested someone had known I'd contacted police, that they were aware of my concerns and had adjusted their behavior accordingly. That implied they were paying very close attention to me, close enough to know when I'd taken action against them. Then I started receiving anonymous messages through various platforms. They'd come through email, through social media accounts I barely used, even through a professional networking site I'd signed up for years ago and forgotten about. The messages were brief and cryptic, usually just mentioning a specific location and time. The coffee shop at 8:15 on Tuesday, the canal path at 6:30 on Friday, the park bench near the playground at 7 on Sunday evening. What made them disturbing was how accurate they were. These were exact descriptions of where I'd been and when, locations and times that weren't public knowledge, that I hadn't shared with anyone. Someone was tracking my movements with precision and letting me know they were doing it, sending these messages as proof that my routine was completely transparent to them. I became hypervigilant about my surroundings, constantly checking if anyone was following me, varying my routes to avoid predictability. But the messages continued, adapting to my new patterns, demonstrating that whoever was sending them could track me regardless of what precautions I took. If I took a different route to work, I'd receive a message mentioning that new route. If I stopped going to my usual coffee shop and tried a different one, a message would reference the new location. A colleague at work suggested that maybe someone had access to my phone's location data. That seemed impossible. I was careful about app permissions, didn't share my location publicly, had privacy settings enabled. But she convinced me to check what apps had location access, and that's when I discovered HealthPath was tracking my location continuously, not just when I was actively using it for exercise logging. The app's permissions showed it had access to my location at all times, even when it was running in the background. I'd granted that permission when I first installed it, clicking through the setup screens without reading carefully, assuming it needed location access for mapping runs, but not realizing it meant constant tracking regardless of whether I was exercising. I immediately revoked the location permission and looked more carefully at what data the app had collected. The history section showed every single location I'd visited over the past 6 months, with timestamps accurate to the minute. Every school I'd worked at, every shop I'd visited, every route I'd walked. It was a comprehensive surveillance record of my life, all stored in an app I'd voluntarily installed because I wanted to track my fitness. But the data wasn't just stored locally on my phone. The app's privacy policy, which I read properly for the first time, explained that location data was uploaded to their servers for service improvement and shared with third-party partners for various purposes, including advertising and analytics. The language was vague enough that it could mean almost anything, and I had no way of knowing who these third-party partners were or what they were doing with my location history. I deleted the app immediately and contacted HealthPath's customer support, asking them to delete all my data from their servers. They responded with an automated message saying data deletion requests would be processed within 30 days, which did nothing to address my immediate concerns about who currently had access to 6 months of detailed location tracking. The anonymous messages stopped after I deleted the app, which confirmed my suspicions that whoever was tracking me had been using data from HealthPath. But that confirmation made everything worse in a way, because it meant my location information had been accessible to someone with malicious intent, someone who'd used fitness tracking data to stalk me systematically over an extended period. A few weeks later, a police detective contacted me. They'd been investigating HealthPath as part of a broader inquiry into location data being sold illegally on the dark web. My name had come up because I'd filed that initial report about being followed, and they'd found evidence that my location data specifically had been sold multiple times through a marketplace that specialized in personal tracking information. The detective explained how it worked. HealthPath had been collecting detailed location data from thousands of users, far more information than necessary for fitness tracking. That data was being packaged into individual user profiles and sold to anyone willing to pay for access. The profiles included complete location histories, regular routines, frequently visited places, predictable patterns that could be used for various purposes including stalking, burglary planning, or targeted harassment. She showed me, with obvious discomfort, the listing that had included my data. It was on a dark web marketplace organized like a commercial database, with search functions allowing buyers to filter by location, age, gender, activity patterns, and other criteria. My profile was listed under active single females in the Derby area with predictable daily routines. The listing included sample data showing the kind of information buyers would receive, screenshots of my most visited locations, examples of my regular routes with timestamps, analysis of my typical schedule showing when I was reliably at home versus when I was away. It was marketed as comprehensive surveillance intelligence, useful for anyone who wanted to monitor someone's movements without their knowledge. The purchase history showed my profile had been bought by 5 different accounts. 5 separate people had paid money for detailed information about my daily movements, my routine, my predictable patterns. The marketplace didn't reveal buyer identities, but the detective explained they were working to trace transactions and identify who'd purchased access to my data and others like it. What made it worse was discovering that HealthPath had known about the data sales. The company wasn't directly selling to the marketplace. That was being done by someone who'd gained unauthorized access to their databases. But HealthPath had been aware of the security breach for months before taking action to stop it or warn users that their location data had been compromised. They'd prioritized avoiding bad publicity over protecting users from potential stalking and harassment. The investigation revealed that tens of thousands of HealthPath users had their location data stolen and sold. The marketplace had been operating for over a year before law enforcement discovered it, during which time countless individuals had been tracked without their knowledge by people who'd purchased their movement patterns and routines. The detective walked me through what they knew about the 5 accounts that had purchased my profile. 2 had been traced to individuals arrested for stalking offenses against other victims. 1 belonged to someone with a history of burglary, who'd apparently been using location data to identify when targets would be away from home. The other 2 remained unidentified, their purchases made through anonymous accounts that couldn't be traced to real identities. Knowing that at least 2 unidentified people still possessed detailed information about my movements, that they'd paid money for access to my location history and could still be monitoring me somehow, was terrifying in a way that's hard to articulate. The silver Audi had probably been one of the 5 buyers, using my real-time location data to show up wherever I was. But I'd never know which buyer it was, or whether the others were still out there, still interested in my routine, still watching for opportunities I couldn't anticipate. The legal consequences for HealthPath were substantial, but felt inadequate. They received fines and were forced to implement better security measures. But that didn't undo the year of data collection they'd allowed to be stolen and sold. The company eventually shut down entirely, unable to survive the reputational damage and legal costs. But by then, the harm was irreversible. I had to change significant aspects of my life to feel even marginally safe. I moved house within 3 months of discovering the data breach, unable to stay somewhere whose location had been sold to strangers. I changed my work schedule and routes as much as possible, varying my patterns obsessively to avoid being predictable. I stopped using any fitness tracking apps or services, stopped sharing location data with any apps regardless of their purpose. But I know the historical data still exists somewhere. 6 months of detailed location tracking, showing everywhere I went and when, preserved in private collections of people who downloaded it before the marketplace was shut down. That information is outdated now, showing addresses I no longer visit and routines I've deliberately abandoned. But it still reveals patterns about my behavior and preferences that could be useful to someone interested in finding me. The psychological impact has been harder to manage than the practical security measures. I'm constantly aware of my surroundings now, checking for cars that seem to follow me, watching for people who appear in multiple locations, unable to relax in public spaces. The paranoia affects my work. I'm distracted during therapy sessions, anxious between appointments, hypervigilant in ways that make it difficult to maintain the calm, professional presence my job requires. I think about those 5 buyers constantly. Who were they? Why were they interested in my movement specifically? What did they plan to do with the information they purchased? 2 have been identified and arrested, but what about the other 3? Are they still monitoring me somehow, still interested in my location, still looking for opportunities to exploit the patterns they learned from data I never meant to share? The detective mentioned that location data from fitness apps had become increasingly valuable on dark web marketplaces. People use fitness tracking innocently, wanting to monitor their health and activity, never realizing they're creating comprehensive surveillance records that can be stolen and sold. The data shows not just where someone goes, but their regular patterns, their predictable routines, their vulnerable moments when they're alone or away from home. She also explained that the 5 purchases of my profile had occurred over several months, suggesting ongoing interest rather than one-time curiosity. Someone had bought my data, monitored me for a while, and the information had been valuable enough that others subsequently purchased it too. I was a product with repeat customers, my movements and routine deemed worth paying for multiple times by different people, whose intentions I'll never fully understand. I gave that app permission to track my location because I wanted to monitor my fitness. I clicked through setup screens without reading carefully, granted access without understanding the implications, used it faithfully for 6 months while it compiled comprehensive intelligence about every aspect of my daily life. That data was stolen and sold to people who used it to follow me, to learn my routine, to know where I'd be, and when, with accuracy, I couldn't have achieved myself. That's what I think about now when I see people using fitness tracking apps, logging their runs and walks, sharing their routes and achievements. Most of them probably have no idea what data they're generating or who might have access to it. They're focused on their health goals, their activity statistics, their personal progress, never imagining that the same information could be weaponized by someone who views their location history as valuable intelligence worth purchasing. The app promised to help me get healthier. Instead, it made me a target for stalkers and criminals who paid money for detailed information about my movements. It created a surveillance record more comprehensive than I could imagine, accessible to people I never met and couldn't protect myself from. And somewhere online, That record still exists. My 6 months of location data preserved in collections I'll never find, potentially being shared through networks I'll never access. I track my exercise differently now. Paper notebook, handwritten notes that never leave my house. No apps, no GPS, no digital records that could be stolen or sold. It's primitive and probably seems paranoid to people who use fitness tracking without incident. But I know what happened when I trusted an app with my location data. I know the marketplace where that data was sold, the buyers who purchased it, the year of surveillance that resulted from wanting to count my steps and map my runs. The data exists. The violation is permanent. And somewhere, someone probably still has my old location history. 6 months of my life mapped out in detail, showing everywhere I went and when I went there. That information is outdated now, but it's still mine, still private, still something I never consented to share with strangers who paid for access to my movements. And that knowledge will stay with me, a constant reminder that the tools we use for self-improvement can be turned against us in ways we never anticipate until it's far too late to protect ourselves. I think the moment things truly went wrong was far earlier than I've ever been willing to admit. I kept trying to pin it on some later decision, some point where everything supposedly shifted, but deep down I knew from the beginning that the work was warped. I just pushed that aside because the money felt effortless, and I convinced myself that anything happening out of sight couldn't possibly touch real people. I used to write harmless classifieds, the dull little ads in local papers about unwanted sofas or gardening services. Then someone offered me far too much money to write near identical listings for sites I didn't recognize, places buried so deeply online that you needed specific tools just to reach them. Now I'm hiding. I don't want to talk about where. I walked out of my life in Birmingham after finally understanding what those listings were actually enabling, what I'd unknowingly stitched together, and who was acting on the words I'd polished to look safe. Because if there's one thing dangerous people prize, it's someone who can make anything sound legitimate. I'd been working for a regional newspaper for nearly 12 years when they decided to close the print edition and move everything online. Half the staff were made redundant, including everyone in the classifieds department, where I'd spent my entire career. I was 51 years old with no real skills beyond writing short, compelling descriptions of items people wanted to sell or services they wanted to advertise. The redundancy payment was adequate but not generous, and I quickly discovered that online classified sites had automated most of the work I used to do. There was no market for someone who specialized in writing appealing descriptions of second-hand wardrobes and garden maintenance services. I spent about 4 months applying for anything remotely suitable. Copywriting positions, content creation roles, even administrative work that might value my attention to detail. Nothing came through, and I watched my savings dwindle while I tried to work out what I was going to do with the rest of my working life. That's when I got the message through a professional networking site. Someone had seen my profile listing my experience in classified advertising and was interested in commissioning similar work for a private client. The rate they offered was extraordinary, £500 per week for what they estimated would be about 10 hours of work. They explained that their client operated specialist classified websites catering to niche markets that valued privacy and discretion. They needed someone who could write clear, professional adverts that would appeal to discerning users while maintaining appropriate discretion about sensitive subject matter. I should have asked what kind of niche markets required such discretion, should have questioned why anyone would pay such exceptional rates for basic advertising copy. but I was desperate enough to accept the work without asking the uncomfortable questions that might have cost me the opportunity. The client sent me login credentials for their classified website, along with detailed guidelines about the types of adverts I'd be writing. The site was unlike anything I'd encountered before. Basic design, minimal graphics, categories for services and items that seemed deliberately vague. My first assignment was to write adverts for what the client described as domestic services. I was given basic details: cleaning services, gardening work, home maintenance, and asked to create professional listings that would inspire confidence and trust. The guidelines emphasized that the adverts should make the services sound reliable, experienced, and discreet. I wrote about a dozen adverts following the brief, each one presenting various domestic services in the most appealing light possible. The client was pleased with my work and paid immediately, then sent me a larger batch of similar assignments for the following week. Over the next few weeks, the assignments followed the same pattern. I'd receive basic details about various services or items for sale, then craft compelling adverts that made them sound trustworthy and professional. The work was straightforward, and the money was keeping me financially stable for the first time since my redundancy. But I started noticing that many of the adverts I was writing contained oddly specific details that didn't quite make sense for normal classified listings. A gardening service that emphasized their familiarity with security systems and property layouts. A cleaning service that mentioned their ability to work with minimal supervision and their discretion about what they might observe in clients' homes. When I asked the client about these unusual emphases, they explained that their users valued comprehensive information about service providers and wanted to know exactly what they were paying for. The explanation seemed reasonable enough, though I was becoming uncomfortable with some of the implications. The assignments became more explicit about what was really being advertised. Instead of general domestic services, I was asked to write adverts for people offering very specific capabilities. Someone who could assess home security vulnerabilities. Another who specialized in gaining access to properties without leaving obvious evidence. A third who offered detailed surveillance services including property observation and routine documentation. I realized I wasn't writing adverts for legitimate domestic services at all. I was helping criminals advertise their capabilities to other criminals who needed assistance with burglary, stalking, or worse activities. My skill at making services sound professional and trustworthy was being used to help dangerous people find accomplices for whatever they were planning. But I couldn't simply stop accepting work without serious financial consequences. The income had become essential, and the client had made it clear they valued reliability and discretion above all else. People who caused problems or asked too many questions might find themselves facing difficulties of their own. I convinced myself I was just writing words, that I wasn't responsible for what people did with the services they found through my adverts. It was just classified advertising, the same work I'd been doing for years at the newspaper. The fact that it facilitated criminal activity didn't make me personally culpable for those crimes. The rationalization became harder to maintain when the client sent me a new category of adverts to write. These weren't for services at all, but for specific opportunities. Someone looking for assistance with a particular project in Manchester, another seeking collaborators for work in Leeds, a third requesting help with an assignment in Bristol. The details were deliberately vague, but the context made it clear these were adverts from people planning crimes who needed additional participants. They were using the classified site to recruit accomplices, and I was writing the adverts that made these criminal opportunities sound appealing and professional. I tried to refuse this type of work, explaining to the client that I was only comfortable writing adverts for services rather than specific opportunities, but they made it clear that refusing assignments wasn't an option. I'd been working for them for months, accepting substantial payments for work I knew was ethically questionable at minimum. Walking away now would mean explaining where that money had come from. So I continued writing the adverts, each one more disturbing than the last. Someone seeking assistance with collecting a debt from someone who wouldn't pay voluntarily. Another looking for help convincing someone to leave their property. A third requesting collaborators for work that required being comfortable with confrontation and potential violence. I was writing recruitment adverts for people planning serious crimes, making assault and intimidation sound like legitimate business opportunities. And people were responding to these adverts, using my carefully crafted descriptions to decide which criminal opportunities to pursue. The breakthrough came when I saw a news report about a violent robbery in Wolverhampton. An elderly couple had been attacked in their home by men who'd shown detailed knowledge of their property layout and security arrangements. The police believed the attackers had received inside information from someone who'd visited the property under false pretenses. Something about the case felt horribly familiar. I checked my records and found an advert I'd written several weeks earlier for someone offering domestic security assessments in the Wolverhampton area. The advert had emphasized their experience with elderly clients and their thorough approach to documenting security vulnerabilities. I couldn't be certain the advert was connected to the attack, but the details matched too closely to be comfortable coincidence. Someone had probably used my advert to find an accomplice who could assess the elderly couple's vulnerabilities, then use that information to plan the violent robbery. I felt physically sick at the realization that my work had potentially enabled serious violence against vulnerable people. But what made it worse was understanding this probably wasn't an isolated case. I'd written hundreds of adverts over the past few months, and any of them could have facilitated crimes I'd never learn about. I started researching news reports from areas where I'd written adverts, looking for crimes that might be connected to the services or opportunities I'd advertised. What I found was a depressing pattern of burglaries, assaults, and harassment campaigns that seemed to correlate with the classified listings I'd created. A home invasion in Manchester that matched an opportunity advert I'd written seeking collaborators for work requiring speed and aggression. A stalking case in Leeds involving someone who'd been under professional surveillance before their harassment escalated. A burglary in Bristol where the thieves had demonstrated intimate knowledge of the property's security arrangements. I was looking at evidence that my adverts were facilitating serious crimes across the country. Every professionally written description I'd created, every trustworthy tone I'd crafted, had helped criminals find accomplices and coordinate activities that destroyed people's lives and safety. But it was discovering the full scope of the classified site that made me understand how systematically evil the whole operation was. Using the login credentials I'd been given for posting adverts, I explored other sections of the site beyond the categories I'd been writing for. There were sections dedicated to specific types of criminal activity, categories for people seeking assistance with harassment campaigns, others for those planning burglaries or assaults, even sections focused on more disturbing crimes I don't want to detail here. The site operated as a comprehensive marketplace for criminal services and opportunities. People could advertise their capabilities, seek collaborators for specific projects, even arrange payment and coordination for complex multi-person operations. And all of it was presented in the professional, trustworthy language I'd been crafting. My adverts were scattered throughout the site, making violence and exploitation sound like legitimate business opportunities that reasonable people might consider. I found discussion sections where users reviewed the services they'd hired through the classified adverts. They rated providers on professionalism, reliability, and effectiveness. They shared techniques and recommendations just like people might review plumbers or electricians on normal classified sites. Except they were reviewing people who'd helped them stalk vulnerable individuals, burgle occupied homes, even commit assaults against people who'd apparently done nothing except exist in a way that offended someone enough to pay for violence against them. One review discussed a service provider who'd been particularly effective at documenting a target's daily routine without being detected. The reviewer praised their thoroughness and professional presentation of intelligence, noting that the surveillance had enabled a successful harassment campaign that had driven the target from their home. I recognized the language from an advert I'd written for a surveillance service, remembered crafting descriptions that emphasized discretion and comprehensive documentation. Someone had used my professionally written advert to find a stalker who terrorized someone into relocating. The realization that I'd facilitated systematic harassment was devastating, but what made it unbearable was understanding the scale of it. There were hundreds of reviews discussing services found through adverts I'd written. Each one represented crimes against real people who'd been targeted by individuals using my carefully crafted descriptions to identify suitable accomplices. I tried to contact the police to report what I'd discovered, but explaining my role without implicating myself proved impossible. I'd been knowingly writing adverts for a criminal marketplace for months. Accepting substantial payment for work I understood was facilitating serious crimes. The officer I spoke to was professional but frank about the legal position I was in. Cooperation might reduce potential charges, but I'd been an active participant in a criminal enterprise and couldn't expect immunity from prosecution simply because I decided to come forward. I was advised to consult with a solicitor before providing detailed information, but I couldn't afford legal representation on my limited savings. I was trapped between guilt about what I'd enabled and fear of facing criminal charges for my role in the operation. That's when I decided to stop writing adverts entirely and distance myself from the whole enterprise. I told the client I could no longer continue the work due to health problems, deleted all the software they'd provided, and tried to convince myself I could move on from what I'd done. But the client wasn't prepared to let me simply walk away. I started receiving messages asking when I'd be available to resume work, reminding me that I'd signed agreements about ongoing availability and discretion. The tone was polite, but contained implicit threats about what might happen if I refused to continue. When I didn't respond to these messages, the harassment became more explicit. I received packages containing printouts of adverts I'd written, with annotations showing which crimes they'd facilitated. The implication was clear. They had detailed documentation of my complicity in serious criminal activity, and they'd use it against me if I caused problems. I realized I was being blackmailed with evidence of my own criminal participation. Even though I'd been an unwitting participant initially, the documentation showed months of knowing cooperation with a criminal marketplace. They could destroy my life simply by providing authorities with evidence of my role in facilitating hundreds of serious crimes. The threats escalated when I still refused to resume writing adverts. I found evidence that someone had been through my flat while I was out, looking through my belongings and leaving subtle signs of their intrusion. They were demonstrating they could access my home whenever they chose, that my security meant nothing against people with professional expertise in circumventing such protections. The final threat came in the form of an advert posted on their own classified site. It was written in my characteristic style, advertising my personal details along with a description of my role in the operation. The advert was presented as an opportunity for anyone who wanted to ensure I remained silent about what I'd discovered. I understood immediately what they were doing. They turned me into a target on their own marketplace, advertising my vulnerability to anyone who might want to intimidate or harm someone who knew too much about criminal operations. I was now listed alongside the victims I'd helped criminals target through my professionally written adverts. That's when I realized I had to leave Birmingham immediately. I withdrew what money I could access, packed essential belongings, and drove to Wales hoping I could disappear long enough to work out what to do next. I've been moving between small coastal towns, staying in places that don't require extensive identification or keep detailed guest records. But I know running away doesn't protect the people who continue to be targeted through adverts on that classified site. Other writers have probably been recruited to replace me, creating the same professional, trustworthy descriptions that make criminal services sound like legitimate business opportunities. The marketplace is probably still active, still facilitating crimes across the country, still enabling violence and exploitation through carefully worded adverts that make destruction of lives sound like reasonable commercial transactions. I keep thinking about that elderly couple in Wolverhampton, about all the other victims whose suffering was enabled by adverts I wrote for a few £100s per week. They trusted that their homes were safe, that strangers wouldn't have access to detailed intelligence about their vulnerabilities. But I helped destroy that trust by making criminal intelligence gathering sound like a professional domestic service. Every carefully chosen word, every reassuring phrase I crafted to inspire confidence. It was all weaponized against innocent people who had no idea they were being targeted by criminals using professionally written advertisements. The classified site taught me that language itself can be a weapon, that the ability to make things sound trustworthy and professional can be exploited to facilitate terrible harm. My skills as an advertising copywriter, developed over decades of legitimate work, were perfectly suited to helping criminals find accomplices and coordinate attacks against vulnerable people. And the worst part is knowing I can't undo any of it. Can't warn the people who are still being targeted through adverts I wrote months ago. Can't protect future victims from writers who've replaced me in crafting professional descriptions of criminal services. All I can do is hide in anonymous bed and breakfasts and hope the people I've angered will eventually decide I'm not worth the trouble of tracking down. I suppose I'm telling you this because I need someone to understand how these criminal marketplaces operate, how they recruit ordinary people by exploiting financial desperation and professional skills, and how they ensure complicity through blackmail and threats. If anyone approaches you with writing work that seems overly generous or requires accessing unusual websites, please question what you're really being asked to do. Please consider why someone would pay exceptional rates for basic writing that could be done more cheaply elsewhere. Because the victims of these marketplaces can't protect themselves from criminals who've industrialized violence and exploitation. They rely on people like me making ethical choices, recognizing warning signs, and refusing to participate in operations that facilitate harm. And I failed them completely, choosing financial security over moral responsibility until it was too late to prevent the consequences of my choices. Now, I live with that guilt every day, knowing that my professionally written words helped coordinate crimes against people I'll never meet, but will always remember. The rain lashed against the windscreen, a relentless drumming that mirrored the throb behind my eyes. 39 years old, a failed business, and now this, ferrying anonymous packages through the sodden, forgotten arteries of this provincial city. My worn hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white against the grey plastic. The van, a rental with a persistent rattle in its exhaust, was my office, my prison, my silent confessor. I once owned a small chain of artisan bakeries. Mark's Marvelous Muffins, I'd called it, a name that now tasted like ash in my mouth. The dream had crumbled faster than a stale scone, leaving behind a mountain of debt and a hollow ache where my pride used to be. Compliance, my old friend, had always been my default setting. Nod, agree, avoid the fuss. It was easier, I told myself, than fighting. Now, it was just easier. The private forum, Midnight Runners, had appeared like a mirage in the desert of my despair. A discreet ad, tucked away in a corner of the dark web I'd stumbled upon during a late-night search for anything that paid cash. Courier work, flexible hours, excellent rates, no questions asked. That last part was the hook, the siren song for a man drowning in his own silence. My first few runs were innocuous enough. Small, lightweight boxes, sealed with industrial-grade tape. Drop-offs in dimly lit car parks behind abandoned warehouses. Pickups from anonymous-looking industrial units. The instructions were always precise, a sequence of coordinates and times, delivered via an encrypted message. I was a ghost in the night, a silent cog in a clandestine machine. The money, transferred directly to a burner account, was surprisingly good. Enough to keep the wolves from the door, to make the monthly debt repayments, to buy another week of fleeting normalcy. Then came the wait. The first heavy package felt like a lead brick. It thudded onto the passenger seat, shifting the van's balance. I felt a prickle of unease, a whisper of something cold against my spine. My instructions remained the same. Collect, deliver, do not question. Compliance, Mark. Remember, just do what you're told. The rain had finally eased, leaving the air thick with the smell of damp concrete and exhaust fumes. The streetlights, sporadic and weak, cast long, distorted shadows that danced in my peripheral vision. Tonight's pickup was an old abattoir, long since defunct, its corrugated iron walls rusting like an ancient wound. The air here was heavy, not just with moisture, but with something else, a faint metallic tang that made my stomach churn. I pulled the van into the designated bay, the tires crunching on gravel. The back door of the abattoir stood ajar, a sliver of deeper darkness against the grey night. No one was visible, just the waiting silence and the rhythmic drip of water from a broken gutter. I clicked off the engine, plunging the cab into near-total blackness. My breath hitched in my throat. This was new. Usually, the package was already waiting, or a shadowy figure would emerge, wordlessly placing it in my van. A low scraping sound echoed from within the building. My heart hammered against my ribs. I swallowed, a dry, uncomfortable gulp. Hello, my voice sounded thin, reedy, swallowed by the vast emptiness. No answer. The scraping continued, growing louder, accompanied by a soft, guttural grunt. I fumbled for my phone, the screen a sudden, blinding rectangle of light. No signal, of course. A figure emerged from the darkness of the abattoir, silhouetted against the faint ambient glow from the city beyond. Tall, broad-shouldered, its movement slow, deliberate. It carried a large, rectangular object wrapped in heavy-duty black plastic sheeting, secured with what looked like industrial strapping. The plastic gleamed wetly in the faint light. Evening, the figure rumbled, its voice deep, gravelly, like stones tumbling in a well. No accent I could place. Here for the pickup? My throat was still tight. Yeah, Mark. The figure didn't offer a name. It simply walked towards the van, its gait steady, unhurried. The package it carried was enormous, far larger than anything I'd transported before. It seemed to sway slightly as the figure moved, an unsettling, almost organic motion. "Open up," the figure commanded, nodding towards the rear doors of the van. I scrambled out, my movements clumsy, my hands trembling as I unlocked the back. The figure reached the van and with surprising strength heaved the package inside. It landed with a dull, heavy thud that vibrated through the metal floor. The air inside the van suddenly felt colder, denser. "That's it," the figure said. "Next drop is... you know the drill." I nodded, unable to speak. The figure turned and melted back into the shadows of the abattoir, leaving me alone with the oppressive silence and the hulking presence in the back of my van. I climbed back into the driver's seat, my hands still shaking. The metallic tang in the air was stronger now, a coppery scent that made my stomach clench. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The package, shrouded in black plastic, seemed to absorb what little light seeped into the van. It was too big, too heavy, too cold. The cold. That was the other thing. Some of the parcels, particularly the heavier ones, had started to feel unnervingly cold to the touch, even through the thick cardboard. And then there were the stains. Dark, irregular patches that sometimes seeped through the cardboard, a faint reddish brown. I told myself it was oil, perhaps some industrial lubricant. But the metallic smell. Tonight, the cold was palpable. A frigid aura emanated from the black plastic, chilling the air in the back of the van. My breath plumed in front of my face. My destination was a deserted car park on the far side of the city, nestled between a derelict factory and a stretch of overgrown wasteland. The usual spot. I drove, the van's rattling exhaust a frantic heartbeat against the oppressive silence of the night. Every bump in the road sent a shiver through me, a primal fear that the contents of the package would shift, would reveal themselves. Curiosity. It was a slow, insidious poison, seeping into the cracks of my carefully constructed compliance. Each heavy package, each cold touch, each reddish stain, chipped away at my resolve. Tonight, the dam broke. I pulled into the deserted car park, the only vehicle for miles. The rain had started again, a soft drizzle now, blurring the edges of the distant city lights. I cut the engine, the sudden silence deafening. My hands gripped the wheel, then slowly, deliberately, I released them. "No," I whispered, the word a desperate plea to myself. "Don't do it, Mark." But the word was meaningless. My body moved without my consent. I unbuckled my seatbelt, my movements stiff, robotic. I climbed out of the driver's seat, the cold air biting at my exposed skin. I walked to the back of the van. The rhythmic drip of rain from the roof racked the only sound. My fingers fumbled with the latch, the metal cold and slick. It gave way with a soft click. I swung open the doors. The black plastic package loomed in the darkness, a malevolent presence. The cold hit me then, a bone-deep chill that stole my breath. It was like standing in a freezer. I reached out, my hand hovering just above the plastic. I could feel the intense cold radiating from it. My fingers brushed against the surface, slick with condensation. It wasn't just cold, it was frozen. My gaze fell upon a corner of the package. The plastic, stretched taut, had a small tear, barely an inch long. And through that tear, a glimpse of something pale, something impossibly white. My heart hammered against my ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage. "Don't do it, Mark. Don't look." But I had to. The need to know, to understand the source of this creeping dread, was an irresistible force. I knelt, my knees protesting against the rough floor of the van. My trembling fingers, cold and clumsy, fumbled at the strapping. It was thick, tightly bound. I tugged, pulled, my nails scraping against the coarse material. Finally, a buckle gave way with a soft snick. I unfastened another, then another. The black plastic, no longer held rigid, sagged slightly. I reached inside the tear, my fingers brushing against something smooth, cold, and strangely yielding. I widened the tear, peeling back a corner of the plastic. The pale object came into full view. It was a foot, a human foot, pale, almost translucent. The toes curled slightly, the nails neatly trimmed, frozen solid. A choked gasp escaped my lips, a raw animal sound. My stomach lurched, a wave of nausea washing over me. I scrambled back, hitting my head on the low ceiling of the van. The coppery smell was overwhelming now, thick and cloying. My eyes darted to the rest of the package, my mind reeling. If that was a foot, then the rest of the package must contain. I didn't need to see more. The image of that pale, frozen foot was seared into my mind. Human remains. I was transporting human remains. My hands flew to my mouth, stifling a cry. The horror of it, the sickening reality, crashed down on me. My phone. I needed to call someone. The police. My fingers fumbled in my pocket, pulling out the cheap burner phone I used for the midnight runners' jobs. No signal. Still no signal. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of shock. I had to get out of here. I had to report this. But who would believe me? A down-on-his-luck delivery driver, caught with a body in his van. The evidence was all against me. My eyes scanned the desolate car park. Nothing. Just the drizzle, the distant city hum, and the chilling presence in the back of my van. My mind raced, a frantic hamster on a wheel. What did I do? Where could I go? The forum. I had to check the forum. There had to be some explanation, some way out of this nightmare. I climbed back into the driver's seat, my limbs heavy, uncoordinated. I started the engine, the familiar rumble a jarring intrusion into the suffocating silence. I drove, not towards the drop-off, but aimlessly, desperately. The image of the foot, so impossibly white and still, flashed behind my eyelids. I found a small, isolated lay-by, tucked away behind a dense copse of trees. No street lights, just the inky blackness and the relentless drizzle. I pulled out my personal phone, the one I kept for real life. Miraculously, there was a weak signal. My fingers flew across the keyboard, navigating to the private forum. My heart pounded with a terrible premonition. I typed in my credentials, the screen flickering to life. My eyes scanned the recent posts, looking for anything, any clue, and then I saw it. A new thread, posted just minutes ago. The title, stark and chilling, stood out like a freshly dug grave. A driver available, reliable, discreet. Beneath it, a photograph. A grainy, low-resolution image of my van. My rental van. And then the details. My name, Mark, my phone number, my address. My world tilted. The air left my lungs in a ragged gasp. They knew everything. They had been watching me. This wasn't some random job. It was a trap. I wasn't just a courier. I was a mark. The horror of the foot in the back of my van was instantly eclipsed by a new, more visceral terror. They knew where I lived. They knew who I was. And they were advertising me. Not as a driver, but as a commodity. A new piece of inventory. My own compliance, my lifelong habit of doing what I was told, had led me here. To this desolate lay-by, with a frozen body in my van, and my own face plastered across a forum for what? The rain hammered against the roof of the van, a frantic drumbeat accompanying the frantic hammering of my heart. I was trapped. There was no escape. They had me. My phone rang, a sudden jarring sound that made me jump. The number was unknown. My hand trembled as I answered. "Mark," a deep voice rumbled, the same voice from the abattoir. No question, just a statement. "You've been a good boy." My breath hitched. "What? What do you want?" A low chuckle, devoid of humor. "We want you to continue being a good boy, Mark. That package in your van, it needs to be delivered to the usual spot. And then you come home." "Home?" I croaked, my voice barely a whisper. "You know where I live?" "We know everything, Mark," the voice purred. "And we know you're a man who understands consequences. You've seen what happens when people don't comply, haven't you?" The image of the frozen foot flashed before my eyes. My stomach churned, a bitter bile rising in my throat. "Yes," I managed, the word tasting like ash. "I understand." "Good," the voice said, a note of satisfaction in its tone. "Now, deliver the package, and then we'll talk about your next assignment." The line went dead. I stared at my phone, the screen dark, reflecting my own terrified face. My reflection, pale and drawn, stared back at me, a stranger in a nightmare. I was no longer just a delivery driver. I was an accomplice, a silent partner in a gruesome enterprise. And my compliance, my fatal flaw, had finally devoured me whole. I restarted the van, my hands clammy on the wheel. The cold from the back of the van seeped into the cab, a constant chilling reminder of my new reality. The rain continued to fall, washing over the city, washing over me, but it couldn't wash away the stain of knowing, the stain of complicity. I drove towards the drop-off point, the deserted car park. The silence in the van was no longer empty. It was filled with the unspoken horror of what I carried and the chilling certainty of what awaited me. My life, once a mundane struggle against debt, had twisted into a grotesque dance with death, orchestrated by unseen hands. And I, compliant Mark, was now one of their puppets. My strings, once invisible, were now pulled taut, binding me to their macabre game. The night stretched before me, endless and terrifying, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I would never be able to unsee what I had seen, or undo what I had done. The weight of it all, heavier than any package I had ever carried, settled deep within my soul, and I drove on, into the inescapable maw of my own making. The familiar coordinates glowed on the GPS, a cold, digital beacon in the gloom. The car park, a desolate expanse of cracked tarmac, stretched out before me, illuminated by the intermittent flicker of a broken streetlight. It was eerily quiet, the only sound the gentle hum of the van's engine and the distant wail of a siren, a mournful cry swallowed by the vastness of the night. I pulled up to the designated spot, a faded painted bay near a chain-link fence. My hands, still trembling, cut the engine. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. I stared at the dashboard, unable to move, unable to breathe. The cold from the back of the van was a physical presence, wrapping around me, seeping into my bones. My eyes drifted to the rearview mirror. The black plastic package, still menacingly large, seemed to pulse in the faint light. The torn corner, a gaping wound, showed just enough of that ghastly white foot to keep the image fresh, vivid, horrifying. A flicker of movement caught my eye, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows near the derelict factory. It moved with a fluid, almost predatory grace, My breath hitched. This wasn't the usual anonymous drop-off. This was different. The figure approached the van, tall and lean, its face obscured by the deep hood of a dark jacket. No, not a jacket. A heavy coat, long and flowing. The figure stopped a few feet from the rear of the van, its stance relaxed, almost casual. "Evening, Mark." A voice, smooth and cultured, floated through the damp air. It was different from the gravelly voice on the phone, yet equally chilling. Right on time. I swallowed, my throat dry. "The package." "Yes, the package," the figure mused, stepping closer. I could feel its gaze, sharp and assessing, even though I couldn't see its eyes. "A rather substantial delivery tonight, wouldn't you say?" My silence was my answer. "Open up, Mark," the figure instructed, a subtle gesture of its gloved hand towards the back of the van. My fingers, numb with cold and fear, fumbled with the latch. It clicked open, a sound like a pistol shot in the stillness. I swung the doors wide. The black plastic, with its horrifying contents, was fully revealed. The figure stepped forward, pausing at the threshold of the van, its head tilted slightly. A long, slender hand, encased in a black leather glove, reached out. It brushed the torn plastic just above the frozen foot. "Ah, yes," the figure murmured, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on its lips. "You found our little surprise, didn't you?" My blood ran cold. You knew." "Of course we knew," the figure replied, its voice laced with a predatory amusement. "We wanted to see if you were truly compliant, Mark. If you truly understood the nature of our work." It glanced at me, and even though I couldn't see its eyes, I felt their piercing intensity. "And you did. You delivered it." A wave of shame, hot and sickening, washed over me. I had complied. I had delivered a body. I had become one of them. What now?" I asked, the words barely a whisper. The figure stepped into the van, moving with an unnatural ease around the massive package. It produced a small silver device from its coat pocket, a scanner. It ran the device over the package. A soft beep confirmed the delivery. "Now, Mark," the figure said, turning back to me, "you go home. And you wait for your next instructions." "My next instructions," I stammered. "But the forum. My details. You posted them. For what?" The figure chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. "Oh, that. A little insurance policy. Just in case you decided to deviate from the plan. To ensure your continued discretion." It paused, its gaze unwavering. "You're a valuable asset, Mark. Reliable, discreet, just like the post says." My mind reeled. They weren't going to kill me. Not yet. They were keeping me as a driver, a silent participant in their monstrous trade. The post wasn't a warning. It was an advertisement. For me. "But the body," I whispered, my voice thick with horror. "What do you do with them?" The figure tilted its head again. "That, Mark, is not your concern. Your concern is to drive, to deliver, to remain discreet." It took another step closer, its presence overwhelming. "Do you understand?" I nodded, unable to do anything else. My compliance, once a shield, was now a chain. "Good," the figure said, its voice softening, yet somehow becoming even more menacing. "Now, leave the package and go home." It stepped out of the van, melting back into the shadows. I heard a faint click, then the distinct sound of a heavy door closing. I peered into the darkness. The figure was gone. The package remained, a silent, chilling testament to my new reality. I closed the van doors, the metal clanging shut with a finality that echoed in my soul. I climbed back into the driver's seat, my hands still shaking, my mind a maelstrom of fear and despair. I drove home, the journey a blur of rain-slicked roads and flashing streetlights. The van, now empty of its gruesome cargo, felt even colder, filled with the lingering chill of death. My small terraced house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. I parked the van, switched off the engine, and sat there in the darkness, listening to the rain. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by the frantic beat of my own heart. I stumbled inside, the familiar surroundings offering no comfort. The scent of stale coffee and old papers filled the air, a stark contrast to the metallic tang that still clung to my clothes, to my skin, to my very being. I stripped off my clothes, throwing them into a corner as if they were contaminated. I stood under the shower, letting the hot water sluice over me, scrubbing my skin raw, trying to wash away the stench of the abattoir, the cold of the freezer, the indelible stain of the frozen foot. But it wouldn't wash off. It was inside me now. I crawled into bed, the sheets cool against my burning skin. Sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the pale, frozen foot, the pristine white nails, the curled toes, and then my own face, superimposed over the image, a grim, silent accomplice. The next morning, the sun, a weak, watery disk, struggled to penetrate the grey clouds. My phone buzzed. A new encrypted message. My heart leaped into my throat. New assignment. Pick-up point. Old textile mill, East End. Time, 2200. Package, standard. Payment, increased, standard. That meant smaller. But the payment increase, it was a bribe, a subtle reinforcement of the chain. I stared at the message, my finger hovering over the delete button. I could run, disappear, but where would I go? They knew everything. My name, my address, my face. They had advertised me. They owned me. My compliance, once a quiet habit, had become a monstrous, all-consuming force. It had led me down a path from which there was no return. I was no longer Mark, the failed baker, the struggling delivery driver. I was Mark, the reliable, discreet courier, the one who asked no questions, the one who delivered. The thought of the money, the increased payment, gnawed at me. It would clear a bigger chunk of debt, buy me more time, more normalcy. A fleeting illusion of control. I pushed myself out of bed, my limbs heavy, my mind numb. The metallic tang was still there, a phantom scent. I walked to the kitchen, the floorboards creaking under my weight. I made a cup of tea, the familiar ritual, a small anchor in the storm of my despair. As I stirred the sugar, my eyes caught my reflection in the dark surface of the tea. A man, hollow-eyed and gaunt, stared back, a stranger. The old Mark, the one who tried to maintain a facade of control, was gone, replaced by this new Mark, a puppet dancing to a macabre tune. I lifted the cup to my lips, the warm liquid a bitter comfort. The night awaited, and I, the compliant Mark, would be there, driving, delivering, lost in the labyrinth of my own making, forever stained by the cold touch of what I carried. The rain had stopped, but the chill remained, and the hum of the van waiting outside was a constant haunting reminder of my inescapable fate. I was a ghost in the night, a silent cog in a clandestine machine. Only now I knew what the machine processed, and I was part of it. The police came to my door 3 times before I finally let them in. Not because I was being difficult, but because I genuinely didn't know what to tell them that wouldn't sound completely insane. How do you explain to two officers from West Midlands Police that you've witnessed a murder, that you know exactly who did it and roughly where it happened, but you can't tell them how you know, because the explanation involves admitting you were somewhere online you absolutely shouldn't have been? I'm sitting in what they call protective custody now, a safe house in Wolverhampton that smells of cigarettes and cheap air freshener. And I still don't know if I did the right thing by coming forward. My name's Helen. I'm 53 years old, and until 6 weeks ago, I was living a completely ordinary life in Birmingham, working as a medical secretary. Then I saw something I wasn't supposed to see, and now everything's different. It started with insomnia, which probably sounds like a boring way to begin a story about witnessing a murder, but that's genuinely how it happened. I'd been having trouble sleeping for months after my divorce was finalized. Nothing dramatic. David and I had just grown apart after 26 years of marriage. No affairs, no big arguments, just a slow realization that we'd become strangers who happened to share a house. The divorce itself was remarkably civil, but afterwards I found myself lying awake at 2 and 3 in the morning, my mind racing through decades of memories and wondering where it had all gone wrong. I'd scroll through my phone for hours, news articles, social media, online shopping I never actually completed, anything to distract myself from the silence of the empty house. That's when I started noticing the adverts for insomnia remedies and sleep aids that seemed to follow me around every website. The algorithms had clearly identified me as someone struggling with sleep, and they were determined to sell me solutions. One advert caught my attention because it wasn't selling anything. It was just a link to an article about alternative approaches to insomnia, things beyond the usual advice about sleep hygiene and avoiding screens before bed. The article itself was fairly standard. Meditation techniques, dietary changes, that sort of thing. But at the bottom was a link to what it described as a community for people with severe sleep problems, a support group that operated through private channels to protect members' privacy. I'd scroll through my phone for hours, news articles, social media, online shopping I never actually completed, anything to distract myself from the silence of the empty house. That's when I started noticing the adverts for insomnia remedies and sleep aids that seemed to follow me around every website. The algorithms had clearly identified me as someone struggling with sleep, and they were determined to sell me solutions. One advert caught my attention because it wasn't selling anything. It was just a link to an article about alternative approaches to insomnia, things beyond the usual advice about sleep hygiene and avoiding screens before bed. The article itself was fairly standard, meditation techniques, dietary changes, that sort of thing. But at the bottom was a link to what it described as a community for people with severe sleep problems, a support group that operated through private channels to protect members' privacy. I should have been immediately suspicious of anything that emphasized privacy and private channels that much. But I was desperate and lonely, and 2 o'clock in the morning makes terrible decisions seem reasonable. I clicked the link and found myself on a website that looked like it had been designed in about 1998. Basic text, minimal formatting, just a simple registration form for joining their community. The registration process was more complex than I'd expected. It required downloading specific software that would let me access their private discussion spaces. Something about protecting members' anonymity and ensuring a safe space for people to discuss their struggles without judgment. The software took nearly an hour to set up properly, and I almost gave up several times when it seemed too complicated for what should have been a simple support group. But eventually I got it working, and found myself looking at what appeared to be a fairly standard online community. Discussion boards about different types of sleep problems, threads where people shared what had worked for them, even a section for just general chat among insomniacs who were awake at odd hours. I spent a few nights just reading through discussions, occasionally posting my own experiences and getting sympathetic responses from other members. It was comforting in a way, realizing I wasn't alone in lying awake at 3 a.m, feeling like the only person in the world who couldn't sleep. But I started noticing that some sections of the community were restricted, requiring additional permissions to access. When I asked about this in one of the public discussion areas, someone explained that the restricted sections were for members who'd been active in the community for a while and had established trust with other participants. It was apparently meant to create more intimate discussion spaces for people dealing with particularly difficult situations. That explanation seemed reasonable enough. Online communities often have different tiers of access based on participation and trust. I continued posting in the public areas, and after about 2 weeks received a notification that I'd been granted access to some of the restricted sections. The restricted discussions were more personal and raw than what I'd seen in the public areas. People talking about the real reasons they couldn't sleep, trauma, grief, guilt about things they'd done or failed to do. It felt like being trusted with genuine human vulnerability, and I found myself sharing more honestly about the sadness and loss I was feeling after my divorce. But there was another category of restricted sections that I still couldn't access. Discussions that required what the system called verified membership. I didn't think much about it initially. Presumably, those were for people who'd been active in the community even longer than I had. It was about 3 weeks into my participation when someone sent me a private message offering to sponsor me for verified membership. They explained that verified sections dealt with particularly sensitive topics that required absolute discretion, and that sponsorship from an existing verified member was how they controlled access to ensure the community remained safe. The person seemed genuine in their messages, and they'd been helpful to me in several public discussions about managing anxiety-related insomnia. They explained that verified sections included discussions about topics that mainstream platforms wouldn't allow, controversial treatment approaches, substances that helped with sleep but weren't technically legal, that sort of thing. I was uncomfortable with the implications, but also curious about what kind of discussions required such elaborate security. The message emphasized that verification was completely optional, that I was welcome to continue participating in the non-verified sections, but that some members found the verified discussions particularly helpful for their most difficult struggles. I accepted the sponsorship partly out of curiosity, and partly because by that point I'd been awake since midnight, and my judgment was impaired by exhaustion. The verification process required confirming my identity through several steps that seemed excessive for an insomnia support group, but I completed them anyway. When I finally gained access to the verified sections, I immediately realized this wasn't about insomnia treatment at all. The discussions were about accessing illegal content, trading various prohibited materials, even coordinating activities that were obviously criminal in nature. I'd somehow ended up in what I later learned was a dark web community that used the insomnia support group as a front for recruiting people into their actual operations. I should have immediately closed the software and deleted everything, should have reported what I'd found to authorities and moved on with my life. But I was frozen by a combination of shock and morbid fascination. I'd stumbled into a part of the internet I'd only heard about in news reports, and some awful part of me wanted to understand what I was actually looking at. The discussions were coded and cryptic, using language that clearly meant something other than what the words literally said. People weren't directly stating criminal intentions. Everything was framed in theoretical or hypothetical terms, but the context made it obvious what they were actually discussing. I found myself scrolling through these discussions over several nights, trying to understand the scope of what I'd accidentally accessed. There were sections for different types of illegal activities, all disguised behind innocuous-sounding category names that wouldn't mean anything to casual observers. That's when I found the section that changed everything. It was labeled something bland like social meetups, but when I clicked through, I found discussions about coordinating what were clearly violent crimes against specific individuals. People were sharing detailed information about targets, their routines, their vulnerabilities, even photographs and addresses. One thread in particular made me feel physically sick. It was discussing someone named Sarah Chen, a woman in her early 30s who apparently lived somewhere in the West Midlands. The thread included dozens of photographs of her going about her daily life, shopping, walking to work, sitting in cafes. Someone had been systematically documenting her movements over what looked like several weeks. The discussion around these photographs was careful and coded, but the intent was clear enough that I couldn't pretend I didn't understand what I was reading. People were planning to harm this woman, discussing the best approaches and timing, even coordinating who would do what. What made it worse was seeing the casual tone of these discussions. People were planning violence with the same matter-of-fact language you'd use to organize a dinner party. There were even jokes and casual banter between the participants, as if coordinating serious harm against a stranger was just another form of social interaction. I spent the rest of that night trying to work out what to do with what I'd discovered. I couldn't report it to the police without admitting I'd accessed these illegal websites, which would presumably make me complicit in whatever was being planned. But I couldn't just ignore it, knowing that a real person was being systematically stalked and threatened. I tried researching Sarah Chen through normal internet searches, hoping to find her social media or some other way to warn her. But the name was common enough that I couldn't identify which of the various Sarah Chens in the West Midlands was the one being targeted. And even if I could find her, what would I say? That I'd been browsing illegal websites and saw her being discussed. I stopped accessing the community entirely after that night, deleted the software from my computer, and tried to convince myself that maybe I'd misunderstood what I was reading. Maybe the discussions were just disturbing fantasies that would never translate into actual harm. Maybe I was being paranoid and overreacting to something that was just tasteless internet conversation. But I couldn't stop thinking about those photographs of Sarah Chen going about her ordinary life, completely unaware that strangers were documenting her movements and discussing how to harm her. Every time I tried to sleep, I'd see those images. Imagine her not knowing she was being watched and targeted. It was about 2 weeks later when I saw the news report. A woman's body had been found in a wooded area near Sutton Coldfield. She'd been missing for several days before hikers discovered her. The news initially didn't release her name pending family notification, but something about the location and timing made my stomach drop. When they finally identified her as Sarah Chen, 32, from Birmingham, I knew immediately that I'd watched people planning her murder and done nothing to stop it. I'd seen the discussions, seen the photographs, understood enough of what was being coordinated to know she was in danger. And I'd convinced myself it wasn't my responsibility to get involved. I spent 3 days in a kind of paralyzed horror, unable to eat or sleep properly, replaying everything I'd read and wondering if reporting it earlier could have saved her life. The police were appealing for information, asking anyone who'd seen anything suspicious to come forward. But how could I explain what I knew without admitting I'd accessed those websites? That's when the police came to my door the first time. They were conducting house-to-house inquiries in the area where Sarah Chen had worked, which was near the medical practice where I was employed. They asked standard questions about whether I'd seen anything unusual, whether I knew the victim, that sort of thing. I told them no, I didn't know her and hadn't seen anything relevant. They thanked me for my time and left, and I felt like the worst kind of coward for not telling them what I actually knew. They came back the second time because they were expanding their inquiries and wanted to know if I'd remembered anything additional. Again, I said no, and again, they left. This time, one of the officers gave me his card and said to call if anything came to mind, no matter how insignificant it might seem. I spent that night staring at his card, trying to work up the courage to call and explain what I'd seen online. But every time I reached for my phone, I'd think about having to admit I'd accessed those illegal websites, about potentially being prosecuted for involvement in something I'd stumbled into by accident. The third time they came to my door, they weren't there for routine inquiries. They'd apparently received information that connected me to the online community somehow. I never learned exactly how they'd traced me, but presumably the people running those websites kept records that law enforcement had eventually accessed. The officers explained that they knew I'd accessed certain websites and communities, and they wanted to know what I'd seen there. They weren't arresting me or accusing me of involvement in Sarah Chen's murder, but they needed any information I had about the discussions and coordination that had happened online. That's when I finally told them everything. About the insomnia support group, that wasn't what it seemed. About stumbling into sections discussing illegal activities. About the specific thread discussing Sarah Chen and the photographs documenting her movements. About reading those discussions and understanding enough to know she was in danger, but convincing myself it wasn't my responsibility to report it. The officers were professional, but I could see the frustration in their expressions. If I'd reported what I'd seen immediately, they might have been able to intervene before Sarah Chen was killed. My delay had potentially cost her life, even if I wasn't directly involved in planning or executing the murder. They took detailed statements about everything I'd seen in those discussions. Usernames I remembered, specific details about what had been posted, even technical information about how I'd accessed the community in the first place. Then they explained that I'd need to be placed in protective custody while they investigated the extent of my involvement and determined whether the people running those communities knew I'd spoken to police. That's how I ended up in this safe house in Wolverhampton, waiting to find out if I'll be prosecuted for accessing those websites or if my cooperation has earned me some form of immunity. The officers who check on me daily have explained that the investigation is expanding beyond just Sarah Chen's murder. They've discovered extensive criminal coordination happening through that community, including planning for additional violent crimes that haven't been carried out yet. They've asked me to testify about what I saw, to help them understand how the community was organized and how people coordinated their activities. I've agreed, partly because I want to help prevent what happened to Sarah Chen from happening to anyone else, and partly because I'm hoping cooperation will reduce whatever legal consequences I'm facing for accessing those websites. But mostly I've agreed because I'm living with the knowledge that I could have prevented a murder and chose not to because I was too frightened of the personal consequences of coming forward. I saw someone being targeted for violence, understood enough to know she was in real danger, and convinced myself it wasn't my responsibility to get involved. The protection officer who stays here overnight tells me not to blame myself too much, that people make difficult decisions when they're frightened and uncertain about consequences. But I can't stop thinking about Sarah Chen, going about her ordinary life in those photographs completely unaware that her movements were being documented and discussed by people planning to kill her. And I can't stop wondering about all the other discussions I saw in those verified sections, all the other targets who might be in danger while people coordinate harm against them through those same coded conversations. The investigation is ongoing and police are apparently making arrests, but they've told me the community was large and distributed across multiple platforms, making it difficult to identify everyone involved. I spend most of my time in this safe house thinking about how easily I stumbled into that community, how a simple search for insomnia help led me to discover systematic coordination of serious crimes. How many other people have accidentally accessed those spaces and then kept quiet because they were frightened of consequences? The protection officer also mentioned that I might be in danger from people who ran that community if they've identified me as someone who spoke to police. Apparently, there have been incidents of witnesses being targeted by criminal networks operating through these hidden online spaces, though she was vague about details. So now I sit here waiting to learn both whether I'll be prosecuted for accessing those websites and whether I'm in danger from the people who ran them, waiting to testify about what I saw, about the discussions coordinating Sarah Chen's murder that I read and understood and did nothing about until it was too late. The insomnia that started this whole situation has gotten worse, not better. I lie awake now thinking about those photographs of Sarah Chen, wondering if she ever felt like she was being watched, if she ever had that uncomfortable sense that something wasn't right, wondering if my reporting the discussions earlier would have made any difference, or if the coordination was already too far along to stop. The police have told me they found evidence in the arrested suspect's possessions that matched details from the discussions I described, proof that those online conversations weren't just disturbing fantasies, but actual coordination of real crimes. Multiple people working together to stalk, target, and ultimately kill someone they'd probably never met before, deciding she'd be their victim. They won't tell me why Sarah Chen was targeted or how she'd been selected, just that she appears to have been chosen somewhat randomly by people who treated violence as a form of entertainment or social bonding. The thought that someone could be murdered, not for any specific reason, but just because strangers online decided to coordinate killing someone, is almost more disturbing than any other explanation. I keep thinking about how I accessed that community looking for help with insomnia, seeking connection with other people struggling with the same ordinary problem. How that simple, harmless desire for community and understanding led me to discover the coordination of a murder. How easily I could have never seen those discussions, never learned what was being planned, never carried this knowledge that I could have prevented someone's death. The protection officer tells me the investigation has led to multiple arrests and prevented at least one other planned attack that was being coordinated through the same community. She says my information was valuable and helped police understand how these groups operate and coordinate their activities. But that doesn't change the fact that Sarah Chen is dead and I saw it being planned and stayed silent. I don't know what happens next, whether I'll be able to return to my normal life or whether I'll always be looking over my shoulder wondering if the people from that community are looking for me, whether I'll face prosecution for accessing those websites, or whether my cooperation will be considered sufficient mitigation. What I do know is that I'll never again think of the internet as a space where criminal activity is somehow distant or unreal. I've seen real violence being planned through casual online discussions, seen how easily people can coordinate serious harm through these hidden communities that most people don't even know exist. And I'll never forget Sarah Chen's face in those photographs, going about her ordinary life completely unaware that strangers were watching and planning and coordinating the violence that would eventually kill her. Never forget that I could have prevented it and chose not to, because I was frightened of consequences that now seem trivial compared to the cost of my silence. The damp chill of the Manchester evening always found its way inside, even with the windows sealed tight. It clung to the threadbare carpet, seeped into the plaster, and settled deep in my bones. Another Tuesday bled into another Wednesday, marked only by the shifting glow of the monitor. My flat, a rented box of beige and off-white, offered little resistance to the creeping greyness of my existence. The low hum of the fridge, the distant wail of a siren, the rhythmic tap of rain against the glass. These were the symphonies of my solitude. Tonight, the internet offered its usual shallow distractions. My fingers, accustomed to the familiar dance across the keyboard, navigated the labyrinthine corridors of obscure forums. I sought something, anything to puncture the dull throb of predictability that defined my days. It wasn't a search for connection, not really. More a morbid curiosity, a desire to peer into the cracks of the world, to feel the brief tremor of something real. That's how I found it, a whispered link on a thread dedicated to forgotten corners of the darknet. The Eye of Kronos, it claimed, a private auction site, a marketplace for experiences. The description was deliberately vague, tantalizing in its ambiguity, unfiltered, live, beyond the veil. My initial reaction was a scoff, a dismissive flick of the wrist, another scam, another digital ghost story. But the seed was planted. I bookmarked the link. It sat there, a tiny, innocuous icon amidst a sea of banality, yet it hummed with an unseen energy. The next day, the bookmark beckoned. My lunch break dissolved into a hypnotic scroll through the site's landing page. The interface was stark, almost brutally minimalist. Black text on a charcoal background. No flashy graphics, no pop-ups. Just a single rotating banner. The unseen, the unheard, the unlived. A login portal shimmered beneath. My curiosity, a passive beast until now, stirred. I created an account, a throwaway email and a password plucked from the ether. The confirmation email arrived instantly, a clinical, unadorned message. No welcoming prose, no marketing spiel. Just a link to the main auction page. The page itself was a grid of thumbnails, each a static image. They were unsettling, not overtly graphic, but imbued with a disquieting stillness. A cracked porcelain doll's face, a single bloodied feather on a pristine white sheet, a blurred image of what might have been a hand reaching from shadow. Beneath each thumbnail, a countdown timer ticked relentlessly, alongside a cryptic title and a current bid in an unknown cryptocurrency. My routine began to warp. The moment I returned from the office, the site became my first port of call. My evenings, once a blur of mindless television and reheated meals, now revolved around these digital auctions. I didn't bid, not at first. I simply watched. The bids climbed, sometimes slowly, sometimes in sudden, frantic surges. The timers expired, and the thumbnails vanished, replaced by an experience completed tag. What happened after that, I couldn't fathom. The mystery only deepened my fixation. The descriptions grew darker, more explicit in their implications, though still cloaked in a chilling poetry. The last breath of a failing star, a symphony of silent screams, the unraveling of the thread. My stomach churned, a mixture of revulsion and an undeniable, sickening fascination. I felt a voyeuristic thrill, a sense of being privy to something forbidden, something the ordinary world kept hidden. One evening, a new listing appeared. Its thumbnail was a close-up of a tarnished brass key resting on a dark, polished surface. The title, "The Door to the Self." The description, brief and stark, read, "Witness the unmaking, the ultimate reflection." The countdown began. Something about it, perhaps its deceptive simplicity, lodged itself in my mind. The bid started low, then escalated with unnerving speed. I found myself holding my breath, my gaze glued to the screen. My fingers twitched, hovering over the bid button. A cold sweat slicked my palms. This was different. This felt personal. The sense of dread was palpable, a physical weight in my chest. Yet I couldn't look away. The timer hit 0. Experience completed. The thumbnail vanished. I felt a surge of disappointment, a strange emptiness. A few days later, a new listing appeared. This time marked "Preview Available." It was a grainy, slightly distorted image of a room. My breath hitched. The wallpaper, the faded floral pattern, peeling at the seams near the ceiling, was unmistakably familiar. It was the wallpaper in my own living room. A cold, sharp shock traveled through me. My flat. It couldn't be. My eyes darted around the room, confirming the impossible. The slight scuff mark near the skirting board, the way the light caught the dust motes dancing above the old armchair. It was all there. A tremor ran through me, a primal fear seizing my gut. I clicked the preview button. The image expanded, still grainy, but undeniably my flat. A low, almost imperceptible hum emanated from the speakers. It was the hum of my fridge, the soft, rhythmic click of the old wall clock in the hallway. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. My mind raced, scrambling for an explanation. A prank? A sophisticated hack? But how? There were no cameras, no hidden devices I knew of. I lived alone. My landlord, a stoic man who communicated solely through terse emails, rarely visited. No one had keys but me. The thought of an intruder, a hidden presence, sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the damp. I stared at the screen, a bizarre mirror reflecting my own reality, twisted and distorted. I searched the image, desperate for a clue, a sign of artifice. Nothing. It was simply my living room, empty, waiting. The anonymity of the internet, once a comforting cloak, now felt like a gaping maw. The listing had a title, "The Observer Observed," and a chilling description. A life unfolds, unseen, unjudged, until now. The countdown timer was already running. This wasn't an auction. This was a live stream. My fingers, numb with shock, navigated to the main page. All other listings had vanished. Only "The Observer Observed" remained, now prominently displayed, a single, horrifying invitation. The preview button had changed to view stream. I hesitated, my cursor hovering. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to close the browser, to unplug the router, to smash the computer. But the morbid curiosity, the desperate need to understand, held me captive. This was it, the ultimate unfiltered experience, and it was mine. I clicked. The screen flickered, then resolved into a live feed. My living room, in real time. The same muted colors, the familiar clutter. The light from my monitor casting a faint glow on the opposite wall. I could see myself, a shadowy figure reflected in the glass of the screen within the screen. The perspective was static, as if from a fixed point in the corner of the room, high above the bookshelf. A low, guttural gasp escaped me. My own living room, my own life laid bare. I felt a profound violation, a stripping away of all privacy, yet no one was physically here. It was a ghost in the machine, A digital phantom. Then a sound. A faint, almost imperceptible creak from the hallway. My blood ran cold. The flat was silent, save for the hum of my electronics. But the stream, that accursed stream, picked up everything. The creak again, closer this time. My eyes darted to the screen. The door to my flat, usually locked with a deadbolt, was slowly, silently opening. A sliver of darkness appeared, then widened. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. My muscles had seized, locked in a tableau of terror. A figure emerged, tall, slender, cloaked in shadow. Its head was tilted, as if observing the room, assessing its emptiness. It moved with an unnerving grace, a predatory stillness. I couldn't make out any features, only the outline of a form, darker than the shadows it cast. It stepped fully into the living room, its presence a palpable weight that pressed down on me, even through the screen. My heart pounded, a frantic drum against my ribs. I wanted to scream, to shout, to run, but I was paralyzed, a voyeur to my own nightmare. The figure paused, its gaze seemingly fixed on the spot where I sat, transfixed. A cold dread seeped into my bones. It knew I was watching. Then it moved, not towards me, but towards the bookshelf, my bookshelf. It ran a gloved hand along the spines of my books, a slow, deliberate caress. My collection of dog-eared paperbacks, the literary companions of my lonely evenings. A profound sense of intimacy, of my inner world being exposed, washed over me. It picked up a framed photograph from the shelf, a faded picture of my parents, taken years ago at the seaside. It held it for a moment, then slowly, deliberately, turned it face down. The small, almost insignificant action felt like a profound act of desecration. My mind screamed, this was real, this was happening. This was not a prank, not a hack. This was an invasion. The figure moved again, gliding across the room towards my armchair. The worn velvet, imprinted with the shape of my body after countless hours of sitting. It reached out, its fingers brushing the fabric, then settling on the remote control, exactly where I usually left it. A low, sibilant whisper emanated from the speakers. It was barely audible, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. You watch. We see. The voice was not human. It was a cacophony of whispers, a chorus of unseen entities, all speaking at once, yet forming a single, chilling utterance. It burrowed into my skull, vibrating through my very being. My eyes darted from the screen to the real-life armchair, then back again. My flat, my sanctuary, had become a stage. And I, the unwitting star. The figure turned its head, its shadowy form now facing the camera directly. I still couldn't discern any features, but I felt its gaze, a cold, unblinking stare that pierced through the screen, through the digital barrier, and into my very soul. It raised a hand, slowly, deliberately. Its fingers, long and skeletal, stretched towards the camera. The gesture was unmistakable, a beckoning, an invitation. My breath hitched. The screen flickered, then went black. The hum of the fridge, the click of the clock, the distant siren. They all returned, amplified in the sudden silence. The monitor, now a dark mirror, reflected my own terrified face. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. My body trembled uncontrollably. The cold sweat turned clammy. I was alone in the flat, yet I felt a presence, an unseen weight in the room. I stumbled backwards, knocking my chair over with a clatter. The sound echoed in the sudden, vast emptiness of the room. My eyes darted to the hallway. The door was closed, locked, or was it? My memory, fractured by fear, couldn't confirm. I scrambled to my feet, my legs unsteady. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every creak of the old building a harbinger of doom. My gaze fell on the bookshelf, the photograph of my parents. It was still face down. A whimpering sound escaped my throat. It was my own. I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the door. My hand fumbled for my phone, a lifeline in the encroaching darkness. My fingers, slick with sweat, struggled to unlock it. What would I say? Someone is in my flat, but I only saw them on a live stream of my flat, which I found on a dark web auction site. They'd think I was mad. My gaze drifted back to the monitor. The screen remained black, but a faint, almost imperceptible flicker of light emanated from its depths. A single pixel, perhaps, or something else entirely. I felt it then, a cold breath on the back of my neck. My hair stood on end. My skin crawled. I wasn't alone. A low, guttural chuckle resonated through the room. It wasn't from the speakers. It was here, in the air, around me. My eyes widened in terror. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs. Nothing. Only the familiar, comforting clutter of my living room. But the feeling persisted, an undeniable, suffocating presence. The chuckle came again, closer this time. A dry, rasping sound. It seemed to emanate from the very walls, from the very air I breathed. Welcome, Andrew. The voice was singular now, no longer a chorus. It was deep, resonant, and utterly devoid of warmth. It knew my name. My blood ran cold. My mind, already fractured, threatened to shatter completely. How did it know? A cold, spectral hand brushed my cheek. I gasped, stumbling backwards, my legs giving way. I fell to the floor, my eyes wide with terror, scanning the empty space. Nothing. No one. Yet the touch was undeniable, leaving a trail of icy dread in its wake. You sought the unfiltered. You found it. The voice was directly above me now, a whisper that vibrated through my bones. And now, you are the experience. Panic, raw and visceral, seized me. I scrambled backwards, crawling across the floor, desperate to escape. My fingers scrabbled at the carpet, seeking purchase, seeking an exit. A shadow detached itself from the wall, coalescing into the familiar, slender form. It stood before me, its head still tilted, observing. Its presence radiated an ancient, malevolent power. The ultimate reflection, it repeated, its voice a silken rasp. The unmaking. My vision blurred, tears of terror streaming down my face. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound emerged. My throat was constricted, my lungs starved of air. The figure extended its hand again, not towards me, but towards my head. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for a blow, for an end. Instead, I felt a gentle pressure, a subtle shift in the air around me. A profound sense of clarity, cold and sharp, flooded my mind. The terror, the panic, the confusion, they receded, replaced by an unnerving calm. I opened my eyes. The figure was still there, but it seemed to shimmer, its edges indistinct. The room, too, had changed. The colors were more vivid, the shadows deeper. Every detail, every dust mote, every imperfection stood out with startling clarity. You are free to observe, the voice murmured, now seemingly coming from everywhere and nowhere, from within. I tried to move, to speak, but my body felt distant, unresponsive. It was as if I was watching myself, a silent spectator in my own skin. My arms, my legs, my hands, they were no longer mine to command. The figure receded, melting back into the shadows from which it came. The room returned to its mundane state, the familiar clutter, the muted colors. But I was no longer the same. I stood up, my movements slow, deliberate, as if I were a puppet on invisible strings. I walked to the monitor, my eyes fixed on the black screen. The single flickering pixel was still there, a tiny, defiant pinprick of light in the darkness. I raised my hand, my own hand, and touched the screen. The pixel pulsed, brighter now, then expanded. It bloomed into an image, a new live stream. It was a room, an unfamiliar room, filled with strange, archaic objects. A flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows on the walls. A figure sat at a table, hunched over a glowing screen. I leaned closer. The screen within the screen showed a grid of thumbnails. One of them, prominently displayed, was a close-up of a tarnished brass key. The title, The Door to the Self. My mind, now unnervingly calm, understood. The cycle, the endless, horrifying loop. I felt a faint, almost imperceptible smile touch my lips. Not my smile, but a smile nonetheless. The cold, analytical observer within me approved. The man on the screen, hunched over his monitor, was unaware. He was about to click the preview button. I've tried writing this so many times I've lost count. Every time, I get a few paragraphs in before I close the laptop and tell myself I'll do it later, when I have the right words, when it doesn't feel like I'm tearing something open inside my chest. But there are no right words. And honestly, I remember everything too well. That's the problem. My brain won't let me forget a single detail. Every conversation, every decision, every moment I chose to keep going when I should have stopped. It's all there, sharp and clear, like it happened yesterday. I'm not writing this to make you feel sorry for me. I'm not asking you to understand. I already know what people will say, that I was broke, desperate, scared. Sure, that's all true, but that's not why I kept doing it. That's the easy explanation, the one that lets me off the hook. The real reason is harder to say out loud, because it means admitting I could turn off parts of myself I didn't know could be switched off, that I could compartmentalize my behavior to a degree that still unsettles me, even now, even after everything. 18 months ago, my life was ordinary, boring even, the kind of boring that other people probably envied. I worked at a marketing agency in Manchester, one of those mid-sized firms that handles accounts nobody's ever heard of, but that somehow keep the lights on. I split rent on the flat with my girlfriend Sarah and convinced myself this was what being an adult looked like. Wake up, go to work, come home, watch something on Netflix, repeat. The job wasn't exciting, but it paid on time, every time. I'd learned to measure happiness by how predictable things were, how stable. Excitement was for people who hadn't yet realized that stability was the real prize. Sarah and I had been together long enough that our routines had merged. We knew each other's schedules, split the bills without arguing about it, had our spots on the sofa. It wasn't passionate anymore, but I told myself that was normal. That passion was just the opening act, and what we had was the sustainable version, the real thing. Looking back, I wonder if I was already trying to convince myself of things I didn't quite believe. The redundancy meeting was surreal in how scripted it felt. I was called in on a Wednesday afternoon, and the moment I saw my manager sitting with someone from HR, I knew. Everyone in that room had already processed what was about to happen to me. They'd had their meetings, made their decisions, prepared their talking points. The company was downsizing. My role was non-essential. Budget cuts, market conditions. They thanked me for my contributions, said they appreciated my work, handed me a folder explaining my final pay and notice period. The whole thing took maybe 15 minutes. I nodded through the whole thing, not because I agreed, but because my brain couldn't catch up. There was this weird disconnect between what I was hearing and what I was processing, like watching something happen to someone else. I even said thank you as I left the room. Thank you. For what? For destroying the stability I'd built my entire identity around. At first, unemployment felt temporary. I treated it like a gap between jobs rather than an ending. I updated my CV, spent hours tweaking the wording, sent out applications. I told Sarah not to worry. Something would come up quickly. Manchester was full of agencies. I had experience, good references. There was no reason to think I'd struggle as much as I eventually did. Except I did. Weeks turned into months. The interviews I did get never led anywhere. I'd spend days preparing, researching the company, practicing answers. And then I'd sit in reception, waiting rooms, feeling my confidence drain away before anyone even spoke to me. The rejections came in waves, all saying the same thing in slightly different language. We've decided to move forward with other candidates. Your experience doesn't quite match what we're looking for. We had a very strong field of applicants. The structure of my days began to collapse. I started waking up later because there was no reason to get up early. I'd make coffee and check my email obsessively, refreshing every few minutes even though I already knew nothing would be there. The flat became smaller somehow, the walls closer. I'd spend hours online scrolling through job sites, telling myself I was being productive when really I was just avoiding the growing panic. Sarah tried to be supportive at first. She'd ask how the job search was going in this carefully neutral tone, like she was afraid of setting me off. She'd tell me something would come up, that I just had to keep trying. But there's a difference between patience and faith, and I could feel the latter calcifying into something harder. She stopped talking about the future, holidays we might take, places we might move to, started focusing on immediate costs instead. Did we really need Netflix and Spotify? Should we switch to a cheaper phone plan? Could we cut back on takeaways? She never directly accused me of anything, but the unspoken anxiety settled into the flat all the same, hovering in every conversation about money. I felt it in the way she'd look at me when I was still on the sofa at 2 p.m, in the way her face would tighten when another rejection email came through. We stopped having sex, stopped really talking, just existed in parallel, waiting for something to change. When she eventually said she needed space, it came without drama. No shouting, no thrown accusations. She just sat down one evening and explained, very calmly, that she felt like everything had stalled, that she couldn't live in this suspended state anymore, not knowing when or if things would improve. She said she still cared about me, but that she needed to think about her own future. I didn't argue. How could I? She was right. I understood her point far too well to pretend otherwise. She moved out in December, a week before Christmas. Took her stuff over 3 trips in a hired van, and each time she came back for another load, the flat looked more wrong. After she left for the last time, I walked through the rooms and realized how much of what made the place feel like home had been hers. Not just physical things, but the rhythm of daily life. The routines that had been keeping me anchored. After that, the flat felt strangely hollow, not empty. All my stuff was still there, but hollow, like a shell. Days stretched in uncomfortable ways. I'd lose track of time, look up from my laptop, and realize it was dark outside and I hadn't eaten. Nights became longer than they had any right to be. I'd lie awake listening to the pipes click and the radiators clank, and the distant traffic hum outside, aware that time was passing but unable to measure it properly. 3 in the morning felt the same as midnight, felt the same as 5 a.m. It was during those nights that I started spending more time online. Not doing anything in particular, just scrolling. Reddit mostly, Twitter, YouTube. It gave my thoughts somewhere else to sit, something to focus on besides the growing certainty that I'd fucked up my life beyond repair. I've always been comfortable with computers, the sort of competence that comes from familiarity rather than talent. I'm not a programmer or anything, but I understood how information connected, how people left traces of themselves behind without realizing, how easy it was to build a picture of someone's life if you knew where to look. Social media, public records, cross-referencing details. At the time, that knowledge felt harmless, academic even. Something I'd never imagined using outside of work. The idea came to me one night in late January while scrolling through Reddit, half asleep, in a thread about alternative ways of making money online. Most of the suggestions were predictable and useless. Match betting, dropshipping, taking surveys for pennies. But one comment stood out precisely because it didn't try to sell anything. The person mentioned, very casually, that there were research opportunities on the dark web for people who were good at gathering information. They said it with such matter-of-fact certainty that I found myself reading it again and again. They'd included a link, not directly to anything illegal, just instructions on how to access hidden services. I told myself I was only curious when I clicked it. Told myself the same thing as I read the instructions, downloaded Tor, and spent an hour figuring out how to navigate to a site that looked disappointingly normal. Plain, text-heavy, functional, like a really bad version of Craigslist from 2004. The pages were stripped down, lacking any visual noise. Forums dominated most of the space, filled with long threads discussing services and reputations in tones that were unsettlingly professional. It didn't feel like a criminal underworld, more like a parallel bureaucracy, governed by its own rules and expectations. People talked about vendors the way you talk about contractors, rating their reliability, their communication, how quickly they delivered. I spent several nights just reading, telling myself that observation didn't count as participation, that I was just curious about how this world worked. Eventually, I came across a listing looking for what they called a data coordinator. The description was vague, but not mysterious. They needed someone to collect publicly available information about named individuals and compile it into clear, organized reports. Basic research skills required. Attention to detail, discretion. What made me stop and really consider it was one phrase: publicly available information. That detail became the hinge on which all my justifications rested. I told myself that if I wasn't hacking or breaking into anything, then it wasn't really wrong. I'd just be organizing data that already existed. The digital equivalent of putting scattered papers into a folder. Anyone could do this if they knew where to look. I'd just be doing it more efficiently. The pay was reasonable, but not extravagant. A few £100 per report. That made it feel legitimate somehow, like a real job rather than something shady. I spent several nights deliberating, checking my bank account, looking at the bills piling up. Then, around 3 in the morning on a Tuesday, I applied. 2 days later, I received my first request. It came through an encrypted message, just a name and a general location in Leeds. Nothing else. No context, no explanation of why they wanted the information. I remember staring at it for a long time, expecting to feel a sense of alarm that never came. The work itself unfolded with surprising ease. Social media provided an outline of the man's life. LinkedIn showed where he worked. Public records filled in the gaps. Electoral roll, company's house, land registry. With enough patience, routines began to emerge naturally. Patterns that were invisible in isolation but obvious when viewed together. He went to the same gym 3 times a week, had lunch at the same cafe on Fridays, posted about football on Twitter every weekend. When I finished, I'd assembled a detailed portrait of a stranger's life, where he lived, where he worked, how he spent his time, what car he drove, who his friends were. I sent the report through the same encrypted channel and waited, feeling a knot of anxiety in my stomach. What if it wasn't good enough? What if I'd missed something obvious? What if they decided I wasn't up to the task? The payment arrived the next day. Bitcoin, converted to pounds and deposited into my account. The relief I felt was immediate and overwhelming. Not just about the money, though that mattered. It was about feeling useful again, competent, like I still had value, like I could still do something well. For the first time since losing my job, I felt like I could breathe properly, like maybe I wasn't completely worthless. More requests followed quickly, 1 or 2 a week at first, then more. I developed templates, checklists, shortcuts. The work became routine, methodical rather than improvisational. I could complete a basic profile in a few hours now, a detailed one in a day. The people I researched stopped being individuals and became just data points, collections of habits and timestamps, numbers on a spreadsheet. I didn't let myself think about what the information might be used for. Debt collection maybe, private investigators, background checks. I told myself it was probably nothing sinister, just boring commercial stuff. And even if it wasn't, well, I was only gathering information that was already public. I wasn't doing anything illegal. Not technically. By March, it had become my primary income. I was making more than I had at the agency, working from home in my pajamas. I stopped sending out job applications, stopped checking recruitment sites. This was working. Why go back to a 9-to-5 when I could do this? The first disruption came in late April. I received a request marked as urgent, accompanied by a payment significantly higher than usual. Double my normal rate, transferred up front. The name was Emma Hartley. The location was Stockport. That was it. No other details. No explanation for the urgency or the premium. I noticed both things, the urgency, the money, and still I chose not to ask why. Curiosity had already been replaced by necessity. Or maybe I just didn't want to know. Emma's digital footprint was extensive in a way that now feels painfully intimate to recall. She was a nurse, worked night shifts at Stepping Hill Hospital. Her Instagram was public, full of selfies and pictures of her morning runs. Fitness apps revealed her exact running routes, the time she went, how long each run took. Facebook showed her shift patterns. She'd post about having a rough night at work, about looking forward to days off. Location tags placed her at specific cafes, specific parks, specific pubs. By the time I finished the report, I knew her routines with a familiarity that felt wrong even as I was compiling it. I knew she ran at 6 in the morning on her days off, that she stopped at the same Starbucks afterward, that she lived alone in a ground floor flat, that her car was parked on the street because the building didn't have dedicated spaces, that she usually worked Tuesday through Thursday nights and had her phone on Do Not Disturb during the day because she needed to sleep. I sent the report and told myself not to think about it, tried to push it out of my mind. But something felt different this time. The amount of detail I'd gathered, the precision of her patterns, the fact that someone had paid double to get this information quickly. 3 weeks later, I was drinking coffee and half watching TV when I opened the Manchester Evening News on my phone. The headline hit me like a punch to the stomach. Stockport nurse missing after night shift. There was a photo. Emma Hartley, the same face I'd been staring at for hours while building her profile. I read the article 3 times, 4 times. She'd left work at 7:30 in the morning. Her car was still in the hospital car park. She hadn't answered calls or messages. Colleagues were worried. Police were investigating. The details aligned too closely with what I'd documented. The hospital, the shift pattern, the usual time she'd leave. I told myself it was coincidence. Had to be. People go missing all the time. It didn't mean anything. Couldn't mean anything. Because admitting otherwise would have meant confronting a responsibility I was not prepared to face. Would have meant acknowledging that I'd helped someone do something terrible. I avoided my computer for several days. Didn't check messages. Didn't take any new requests. But financial reality eventually pushed me back to work because fear alone doesn't stop bills from arriving. And I had rent due, council tax, electricity. I couldn't afford to stop. The message that followed didn't come through the usual system. It arrived directly, somehow, in my regular email, which should have been impossible. I'd been careful about keeping things separate, used different devices, different networks. But there it was, in my inbox, with no sender name. Just a subject line. Excellent work. The message praised my discretion and attention to detail. Said they had a special project that required someone with my particular skills. 5 individuals across the Northwest. Profiles needed within a week. The figure attached was more than I'd earned in the previous 2 months combined. Before I could even respond, before I could think about whether to accept, half the payment transferred into my account. That was when I understood, fully and clearly, that whatever legitimacy I'd imagined no longer existed. This wasn't debt collection or background checks. This was something else entirely. Something I should walk away from, should go to the police about, should refuse absolutely. I accepted anyway. The task involved 5 people, 3 in Manchester, 1 in Liverpool, 1 in Bolton. Each profile required a level of detail that went far beyond my previous work. Not just routines and locations, but vulnerabilities, security systems, household layouts, family members, financial situations. I spent that week in near isolation, barely sleeping, working obsessively, accessing databases I should never have seen, combining information in ways that made me increasingly uneasy. I knew what I was doing by then, couldn't pretend otherwise, but I kept going because I'd already taken half the payment and because stopping would have meant admitting to myself what I'd already become. When I sent the final report, the remaining payments arrived within minutes. Looking at my bank balance, I felt briefly untouchable, like I'd gotten away with something, like I was smarter than everyone else. That feeling lasted less than a week. News reports started appearing. A break-in in Didsbury, fraud case in Liverpool, an assault in Bolton. Each one aligned too closely with the profiles I'd created to dismiss as coincidence. The break-in happened at exactly the time I'd identified as optimal, when the residents were at their weekly evening class. The fraud-targeted accounts I'd specifically noted were vulnerable. The assault victim was attacked on the route I'd mapped as isolated and poorly lit. I stopped reading after the 3rd incident. By then, denial felt more dishonest than knowing. I tried to stop. Stopped responding to messages. Stopped checking the encrypted channels. Told myself I was done. That I'd made enough money to last a few months. That I could go back to looking for legitimate work. That I could pretend the last few months hadn't happened. Then things got strange. My account started behaving oddly. Emails disappeared from my inbox. Ones I'd definitely received. Ones I'd read multiple times. My phone started doing things I couldn't explain. Opening apps on its own. The camera light coming on when I wasn't using it. Messages I'd sent vanishing from my conversation history. Then came the message, short and direct. You are either an asset or a liability. Choose wisely. The photograph arrived the next morning. It showed me sitting at my desk, face illuminated by my laptop screen, taken from outside the flat, through the window, at night. The angle suggested it was taken from the street, maybe from a car. The timestamp was from 2 nights earlier. I'd been alone in the flat, thought I was safe, thought I was anonymous. Seeing myself from that perspective made something inside me collapse, because it demonstrated, with brutal clarity, how easily the same techniques I'd used on others could be applied to me. I knew my own patterns, knew my routines, knew exactly how vulnerable I was. And now someone else knew them too. I went to the police the next day, walked into the nearest station and told them I needed to report a crime. When they asked what had happened, I said I wanted to report myself. They arrested me that afternoon, took my laptop, my phone, everything, interviewed me for hours across multiple days. I told them everything. Every request I'd taken, every profile I'd built, every piece of information I'd gathered. Showed them how to access the forums, how the payment system worked, everything I knew about the people I'd worked for, which wasn't much. I cooperated completely, not because I expected leniency, but because I no longer believed in the possibility of undoing what I'd already set in motion. They charged me with multiple offenses: conspiracy, computer misuse, data protection violations. The solicitor they assigned me said I'd probably get prison time. Said cooperation would help, but wouldn't erase what I'd done. I told him I understood. Now I'm waiting for my court date. Still in the same flat, still going through the same routines, but watching them with an awareness that didn't exist before. The police reassure me that the people I worked for are unlikely to pursue me further, that reporting them was the right thing to do, that I'll be safe. But reassurance doesn't erase knowledge. I know how these profiles are built, know how much information exists about any given person if you know where to look, know how patterns emerge from seemingly innocuous details, know how easy it is to map someone's entire life if you're patient enough. I know how patient the people who use this information can be, how they can wait weeks, months, for exactly the right moment, how they think in longer timescales than normal people do. And I know that somewhere, it's entirely possible that my life exists as a document, neatly organized, comprehensively detailed, created using the same methods I once relied upon. Someone knows where I live, where I shop, what time I usually go to sleep, which window doesn't lock properly, which neighbors are home during the day, when the police patrol this street. That knowledge doesn't fade with time. You'd think it would. You'd hope that eventually you'd stop checking over your shoulder, stop flinching at unexpected noises, stop analyzing every stranger who walks past your building. But it doesn't work that way. It just sinks deeper, becomes part of you, sits there in the dark where you can't quite see it, but you always know it's there. Every time I hear footsteps in the hallway, every time a car idles outside for too long, every time my phone does something unexpected, every time I'm alone in the flat late at night, waiting, always waiting. The redundancy letter came on a Tuesday. After nearly 8 years managing the procurement department at a manufacturing firm in Sheffield, I found myself with 3 months severance pay and absolutely no idea what to do with my time. My wife had left the previous autumn, something about needing space and finding herself. So it was just me rattling around our terraced house near Hillsborough, trying to make sense of what felt like my life falling apart. Unemployment benefit meetings became my only real human contact. The job centre appointments every fortnight, sitting across from advisors who looked barely old enough to vote, discussing my transferable skills and career objectives. Between those soul-crushing sessions, I filled my days with daytime television and long walks through the city centre, watching everyone else hurry to places they needed to be. That's when I started spending more time online. Not job hunting. I'd given up on that after the first month of automated rejection emails. Instead, I found myself drawn into forums and message boards, places where people discussed everything from conspiracy theories to urban exploration. It was on one of these communities that I first heard about the hidden parts of the internet, the areas that ordinary browsers couldn't reach. A user called DarkMatter47 had posted about accessing restricted networks, claiming there were entire communities operating beyond normal search engines. The post was vague but intriguing, mentioning special software that could bypass conventional internet filters. Other users replied with technical terms I didn't understand, and references to places that sounded almost mythical. My curiosity got the better of me. I'd always been reasonably tech-savvy. Nothing professional, but enough to troubleshoot computer problems and set up home networks. Within a few hours of reading that initial post, I'd managed to access what they called the dark web. The process was surprisingly straightforward, once you knew what you were looking for. The first few weeks were disappointing. Most sites looked like they'd been designed in the late 90s, with basic layouts and poor navigation. I found marketplaces selling questionable goods, political forums full of paranoid rambling, and endless discussions about digital privacy. Nothing seemed particularly shocking or dangerous, just a collection of people who preferred anonymity. Then I discovered the streaming communities. It started with a link shared in a private message from someone who'd noticed my activity on various boards. The link led to a forum dedicated to exclusive content, videos and live streams that weren't available through conventional platforms. The description claimed these were raw, unfiltered broadcasts from around the world, the kind of footage that mainstream media wouldn't dare show. Most of the content was exactly what you'd expect. Grainy videos of protests, industrial accidents, medical procedures, the sort of thing that satisfied a morbid curiosity but wasn't particularly disturbing. Users would comment on the footage, discussing technical aspects or sharing similar experiences. It felt like being part of a secret documentary society. The live streams were different. These weren't recordings but real-time broadcasts, usually announced hours in advance with cryptic titles and brief descriptions. I started attending these sessions regularly, partly out of boredom and partly from a growing fascination with this hidden world. Most streams were mundane. Someone broadcasting from a construction site after hours, or footage from security cameras in empty office buildings. Occasionally, there would be something more interesting. Abandoned locations, restricted areas, or informal tours of places the public couldn't normally access. The chat alongside these streams was usually sparse, with viewers making brief technical comments or asking questions about locations. It was during my third month of unemployment that I noticed a pattern emerging. Certain usernames appeared regularly in the more exclusive streams, and these users seemed to have access to content that required special invitations. They would reference private rooms and special sessions using language that suggested something beyond urban exploration or architectural voyeurism. One evening, a user called Streamwatcher sent me a private message. They'd noticed my regular participation and wondered if I might be interested in accessing premium content. The message was carefully worded, discussing immersive experiences and unique perspectives without explicitly stating what this involved. They explained that access required verification, not payment, but proof of genuine interest and discretion. The verification process took nearly a week. I had to provide details about my online activity, answer questions about my motivations, and demonstrate my understanding of digital security. Throughout this process, Streamwatcher remained professional but vague about what I was actually applying for. They mentioned that the content was intense and not suitable for casual viewers, but assured me that everything was legal and consensual. When my access was finally approved, I received instructions for joining a stream scheduled for the following Friday evening. The message included specific technical requirements and warned that recording or sharing content would result in immediate exclusion and potential consequences. The session was described as a live interactive experience, lasting approximately 2 hours. Friday arrived with typical British weather, persistent drizzle that had been falling since morning. I'd spent the day feeling increasingly nervous about the evening stream, unsure what I'd committed myself to. By the time the session was due to begin, I'd convinced myself it would probably be another disappointing urban exploration broadcast. The stream started promptly at 9 o'clock. Unlike previous sessions, this one had no visible chat function. Instead, viewers could send private messages to the host, who would occasionally respond by adjusting camera angles or moving to different areas of what appeared to be a basement or underground space. The image quality was excellent, far superior to the usual grainy footage I'd become accustomed to. The location looked like a converted cellar, with concrete walls and professional lighting equipment. A single figure wearing dark clothing moved through the frame, preparing various items on a metal table. Their face was never visible, either kept off camera or obscured by shadows. What happened next changed everything I thought I understood about human nature and my own moral boundaries. The figure gestured towards something outside the camera's view, and another person entered the frame. This individual appeared confused, uncertain, looking around the space as if trying to understand where they were. The host began what could only be described as a performance, but one that became increasingly disturbing as it progressed. What started as psychological intimidation gradually escalated into physical harassment. The confused person, I still can't bring myself to think of them as a victim, even though that's clearly what they were, seemed to realize their situation and began showing obvious signs of distress. I should have closed the browser immediately, should have reported what I was seeing to the authorities. Instead, I found myself frozen, unable to look away from something I knew was fundamentally wrong. The professional lighting, the multiple camera angles, the host's methodical approach, everything suggested this was far from spontaneous. Other viewers were clearly watching. Messages appeared on screen occasionally, brief comments from the host acknowledging specific usernames. Some messages contained suggestions or requests, which the host would sometimes implement. It became clear that this wasn't just a broadcast, but an interactive experience where viewers could influence what happened. The session continued for nearly 2 hours. By the end, I was physically sick and trembling uncontrollably. The person who had entered the frame confused and uncertain was no longer moving. The host calmly began cleaning the space, methodically removing evidence of what had occurred. In the final minutes, the host addressed the camera directly. Though their face remained hidden, they spoke clearly about the successful session and thanked viewers for their participation. They mentioned that recordings would be available through private channels and that the next live session was already being planned. The stream ended abruptly, leaving me staring at a blank screen in my darkened living room. Outside, the rain continued falling, and I could hear traffic passing on the main road. Normal sounds from a normal evening in a normal neighborhood. But nothing felt normal anymore. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw fragments of what I'd witnessed. Not just the violence, though that was horrific enough, but my own inaction. The realization that I'd sat through the entire broadcast without attempting to help or intervene. The following week, I received another message from Streamwatcher. They thanked me for attending the session and asked for feedback on the experience. They mentioned that my viewing history suggested I was a committed participant and wondered if I'd be interested in more exclusive content. The message included links to archived sessions and information about becoming a premium member. I deleted the message without responding, but I didn't delete the links. That was 3 months ago. I found a new job, nothing exciting, just administrative work for the local council, and I'm slowly rebuilding some semblance of normal life. I changed internet providers, replaced my computer, even moved to a different area of the city. I told myself these were practical decisions, unrelated to what I'd seen online. But I still have those links. They're saved in a folder buried deep in my new computer's file system, hidden among dozens of other directories. I haven't accessed them, but I know they're there. Sometimes, late at night, when sleep won't come, I find myself navigating closer to that folder, my cursor hovering over the links. I've started noticing things around the city that I hadn't seen before. Vans parked in unusual locations, people who seem to be watching rather than simply waiting. Buildings with multiple security cameras that don't match their apparent purpose. Probably just paranoia, the result of knowing what kinds of activities are hidden beneath the surface of normal life. Yesterday, I received a package at my new address. No return details, just my name and the correct postcode written in careful block letters. Inside was a small wireless camera and a handwritten note with an address across town. The note simply said, "Your turn to contribute." Friday 9 p.m. I've thrown the camera away twice now. Both times, I've gone back to retrieve it from the bin. The address is in an area I don't know well, somewhere near the industrial estates on the outskirts of Sheffield. I looked it up online. It's registered as a storage facility, the kind of place people rent when they need extra space for household items or business equipment. I keep telling myself I won't go, that I'll ignore the invitation and carry on with my new job, my clean computer, my attempts at normal life. But Friday is tomorrow, and I know exactly how long it takes to drive to that address. The camera is sitting on my kitchen table now, next to my car keys. I haven't decided anything yet, but I know that something fundamental changed the night I watched that stream. The boundaries I thought were permanent turned out to be more flexible than I'd imagined. And once you cross certain lines, even as an observer, it becomes increasingly difficult to remember why those boundaries existed in the first place. The rain is starting again outside. Same persistent drizzle that was falling the night everything changed. In about 24 hours, I'll either be at home, trying to sleep through another night of guilt and confusion, or I'll be somewhere else entirely. The worst part isn't the fear of what might happen if I go. It's the fear of how much I want to find out.